Welcome back. We're looking now at part 3 of our lecture over chapter 25 in Bill Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek Grammar, discussing the Greek perfect tense. We covered a large part of the material in chapter 25 in part 1. In part 2, we talked about the middle voice. That was its own separate video because in the 4th edition of Bill Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, the middle is introduced in chapter 18 rather than in chapter 25, as in the 3rd edition. So we compare the information in both the 3rd and 4th editions and some supplementary material as well, so students will have a good understanding of the middle for themselves. Let's open up our part 3 lecture in prayer. Lord, we're thankful for this time that we can study your word. We pray that you'd strengthen the students to be able to understand, know, love, preach, teach, use your word in their lives and in their ministries for your glory in a greater way through what they're going to learn in this lecture. Please be with me and bless my teaching for your glory. And we just commit this time to you. And we thank you for your goodness and grace to us in Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. Having concluded our discussion of the middle voice in part 2, we're now back in a portion of chapter 25 that's quite similar in both the 3rd and 4th editions. So first, let's discuss the previous words section in Basics of Biblical Greek, pages 232 to 234. Now, the previous words section in the 3rd edition of Basics of Biblical Greek appears on, like I said, those pages 232 through 234, and it's quite large. However, you would do very well to spend the time to carefully and slowly go through it, making sure that it all makes sense. If you come across something that does not make sense, go back into chapter 25 and see why what happens takes place. If you cannot figure it out, ask a fellow student, a fellow mathetes, or ask your didaskalos, ask your teacher for help. Now, this chapter, chapter 25, contains the last previous words section that you are going to encounter in Bill Mounce's grammar. Now, Basics of Biblical Greek 4th edition does not contain a previous word section here, probably because the material also appears in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section at the back of the book. That's pages 370 through 380 of the 3rd edition, or pages 450 through 460 of the 4th edition. So if you have the 4th edition of BBG, please follow what I'm going to do in the previous word section right now by looking instead at the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section in the back of the 4th edition. So if you're in the 3rd edition, you're going to want to be on page 232, looking at the previous word section. If you've got a 4th edition, you're going to want to be on page 450, looking at the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section. You should be able to go through each of the words in the previous word section and understand how the perfect active and passive are formed and be able to recognize them. Now, if you find the size of the previous word section a little bit intimidating, be encouraged from the small size of the vocabulary section on page 232. You only have 3 words in the vocabulary section. So you can take some of the time that you don't need to spend memorizing new vocabulary words and direct it to making sure you understand the previous words section. So let's go ahead and get started looking at that previous words section if you're in the 3rd edition. And again, 4th edition, just go to the back, tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament, and you'll be able to follow along over there just fine. Now, as I go through this list, see if you can understand why the verb forms its perfect tense stem as it does. Pause the video before each new word and see if you can understand what is going on before listening to the explanation that I provide. Now, the first example, akuo, is actually a challenging one. So if you can explain akuo, then you're an amazing mathetes. And if you can sense that the form looks perfect, looks like a perfect tense, but you can't explain why, you don't need to feel bad. The examples that follow akuo are generally much easier to explain than this first one. So don't get intimidated by the first one. So the first verb in the previous word section here in pattern 1A verbs is akuo. So it has a perfect active tense form, akeka, and it has no middle or passive form. That's why there's this line here. Now recall that we learned the 4 verb patterns in Basics of Biblical Greek, chapter 20. Pattern 1 is root not modified. That's 20.6 in BBG 3rd edition, 19.3-4 in BBG 4th edition. For pattern 1, we have roots that end in a iota or an upsilon, contract verbs, and roots ending in a stop. As I already said, figuring out the perfect tense forms of akuo is more challenging than almost all of the other forms on this chart. The second verb we will talk about, echo, is also quite challenging, but do not get intimidated by the explanations. The large majority of these verbs have perfect forms that are much more easily understood. So you learned akuo in chapter 16, memorizing its root as aku, gesundheit. The root is not changed in the present tense stem, so the present tense is akuo. Well, why is the perfect active akeka? Well, looking at Basics of Biblical Greek 25.14 in the 3rd edition or 25.16 in the 4th edition, we know that akuo is a second perfect. So the tense formative is alpha instead of kappa alpha. What about the front of the word? Well, that alpha kappa eta kappa looks like reduplication with a second alpha lengthening to eta. So akeka is a bit unusual, something that you'll likely want to memorize. It is in blue in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament as a form that you ought to memorize. In the 3rd edition, they put those ones that are more likely to need memorization in blueprint, which is a nice feature of the 3rd edition. We're going to look at that list in the back of Mounce later in this lecture. However, even if akeka seems a bit unusual, you can see that it looks a lot more like a perfect active than anything else. If you want to know the technical explanation for what is going on here, it's what Mounce says in his Morphology of Biblical Greek 32.6. It's something called Attic reduplication. Now, Attic reduplication is a special form of reduplication that applies only to certain words in the perfect. If one of these verbs begins with alpha, epsilon, or omicron, followed by a single consonant, the vowel and consonant were both reduplicated, and the original stem vowel was then lengthened, alpha to eta. In other words, the word underwent both a reduplication and a lengthening. So you have akuo from ka to ka to akeka. So that's more information than you need to be concerned about at this point. What you want to be able to do is recognize that akeka is a perfect tense form of akuo. In this case, the changes are significant enough that you probably should just memorize the form. The next 3 verbs in the pattern 1A section, archomai, dunamai, and didasko, do not have perfect active or perfect middle passive forms. Well, why does echo become skk? Well, that form is also one that is in blue in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section in the back of the 3rd edition. It's a hard one that you should probably just memorize. Now, Mounce explains what's going on with skk in the 3rd edition on page 376 or on page 455 of the 4th edition. He says, what happens to echo is quite fascinating, but perhaps at first you might just want to memorize the tense stems. And that's my recommendation for you. Just memorize this form. But if you want to know, we're giving an explanation too. The root is sech. In the present tense, the sigma is replaced by the rough breathing. So you just have heko. But because the Greeks did not like the 2 aspirate sounds of the rough breathing and the key in a row, the rough breathing deaspirates to smooth breathing. So you go from sech to hech to ech, and then you have echo. Therefore, in forming the imperfect, because the verbal root actually begins with a consonant, the augment is the epsilon. But then the sigma is between 2 vowels. So it drops out, and epsilon epsilon contracts to epsilon iota. Epsilon plus sec to epsilon, epsilon, he to achon. In the future, the tense formative sigma joins with the he to form xi, but then there are not two aspirates in a row, so the rough breathing can remain. So that's why you have the hexo. In the aorist and perfect active, the epsilon between the sigma and the key drops out, and the perfect and eta is added before the tense formative. So that's the perfect. That's what we're looking at here. So how do I summarize that? I'd summarize it this way. In other words, this is a form you should probably memorize right now. So we're going through these so you can see what you need to just memorize and what you can avoid memorizing by remembering the rules. So this one, just like the one on akeka and eskeka, probably those are two you should just memorize. The next verb after echo is thelo. You can see that it does not have either a perfect active or a perfect passive in the New Testament. Then we have our paradigmatic verb luo, which does not show up in the perfect active, but does have a perfect passive lelumai. If you could not explain what happens with akuo, that's not a problem. It's really complicated, and I would estimate that for the large majority of students, simply memorizing the tense form is best. On the other hand, if you cannot explain how you go from the root lu to the perfect middle passive lelumai, you may need to watch this lecture a second time. So obviously here we have reduplication plus the perfect middle passive tense stem plus primary middle passive personal endings with giving you lambda plus epsilon plus lu plus mai to give you the form lelumai. So that's easy. You should be able to do that one just with the rules for sure, and you wouldn't need to memorize that form specifically. Then with pistuo, the verb I believe, we have a perfect active form pepistuka and a perfect passive form pepistuma. Can you see how these perfects are formed? With the perfect active, we have the root pistu. We have consonantal reduplication at the front, so we have pepistu. And then we add the tense formative kappa alpha after the stem, giving us pepistuka. This form should be very easy to recognize and replicate. Similarly, with the middle passive form, we have consonantal reduplication at the beginning of the word. Then we have the stem. Then the first person primary middle passive ending mai, giving us pepistumai. So if you could not figure out what happened with akuo or with echo and concluded you just needed to memorize their forms, that's perfectly understandable. If you cannot figure out how the rules get the forms of luo or pistuo, that's a problem. By the way, on accordance here, this little close quote mark, I think that's a typo. Just ignore that. It's not significant. So there should be no need to specially memorize the perfect active and passive forms of pistuo. They're deduced with perfect regularity from the root. Next, we have the deponent verb paruomai. We have a middle passive form peparuomai, and we similarly experience consonantal reduplication at the front of the root. Perfectly normal, no problem. Let's move on to the contract stems within pattern 1. So we have the verb agapao, I love. Here we have a perfect active form agapeka and a perfect passive agapemai. You should be able to see how these perfects are formed. You have vocalic reduplication from the root agapa, giving us agap. Then you recognize that as a contract verb, the contract vowel lengthens. So we have agape, and then we have the perfect active tense formative kappa alpha, giving us the form agapeka. The same process takes place for the perfect middle passive, with the exception that we're supplying a primary middle passive ending, so we have agapemai. No problem. The perfect active akalutheka comes from the lexical form akalutheo and is exactly what we would expect. From the root akaluthe, we have vocalic reduplication so that the initial alpha lengthens to an eta. The stem vowel epsilon lengthens to eta because we have a contract verb, as we learned in Basics of Biblical Greek 25.13, 3rd edition, or 25.15, 4th edition. We thus have the regular perfect active tense form akalutheka. As we've done the first 5 of these, I think you can see how the process works. Now, can you see how much easier those last 3 were than the akuo and the echo? So please work your way through the rest of the pattern 1B verbs listed on pages 232, 233, either right now by pausing the lecture, which may be best so you don't forget to do it later, or soon after watching the lecture. So if you want to pause it, this is a good place to do it right now. Go through the rest of them. Let me point out that my physical copy of Basics of Biblical Greek 3rd edition does not have a digamma in footnote 22 on page 232 concerning kaleo. Concerning the perfect tense forms of kaleo, the same basic changes occur to both perfect forms. See balo below. The root of kaleo is kaleo. Recall that digamma has a w sound. The stem vowel, oblot, and digamma have dropped out, and the final epsilon is lengthened to eta. If you want to learn more about the digamma, you can review chapter 17 of Basics of Biblical Greek or section 27 in Mounce's Morphology of Biblical Greek. But whether you do that or not, I do not think that kekle and keklemai are difficult to identify as the perfect active and perfect middle passive of kaleo. So you're probably good with those. The forms should then be easy up to harao. So laleo, lalalika, lalalimai. I don't think that should give you any problems. Well, let's look at this harao here. So in harao, you have a perfect active tense form, heoraka. Now, heoraka is another form in blue in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section in the back of the 3rd edition. So you probably should just memorize that perfect active tense form, heoraka. But in that section, Mounce does provide an explanation for the perfect. He says, there's both a lengthening and an augment. So ara goes to ora, goes to eora, goes to haoraka. Ah, you say, I see what is going on with harao. Anyway, this verb is another one you should probably just memorize. The rest of the pattern 1B verbs should give you no trouble. The plerao, the poieo, the proskuneo, tereo. Okay, no problems there. So, but go through and make sure that's the case. I would encourage you to pause the video here, go through the rest of those pattern 1B forms now, and make sure you see why they look like what they look like. Let's go on to the pattern 1C verbs, those ending in a stop. You should also have few difficulties with these ones. So baptizo has a perfect middle passive form of bebaptismai. Recall that baptid is the root of baptizo. The consonantal reduplication at the beginning of the word is exactly what we would expect. The dentals delta and mu change to sigma mu, as Mounce points out in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section. So I think this form is easy enough to recognize that you may very well not need to memorize it. You next come to grapho, with this perfect active gegrapha and perfect middle passive gegramai. The root is graph, and nothing in the form gegrapha is out of the ordinary other than that grapho is a second perfect, as we learned in Basics of Biblical Greek 25.1 4th edition, 25.16 4th edition. So it's got that tense formative alpha instead of the kappa alpha. As for gegramai, the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more section in the back informs us that the combination phi mu becomes mu mu. So we do not have gegraphmai, but gegramai. Okay, so phi mu to mu mu. I think the perfect middle passive form is still easy enough to recognize that you probably do not need to memorize it separate. Doxazo comes from the root doxad with a delta at the end. For the perfect middle passive form didoxasmai, we're told in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more section in the back that delta mu combination forms sigma mu. So that's why we've got a sigma mu here in didoxasmai. I believe that this form is quite easily recognizable as the 5th tense form of doxazo, so memorization may not be necessary. Lambano has a perfect active tense form, elepha. This form is different enough that you would be best off memorizing it. From the root lob, Mounce tells us what's happening though. So the vocalic reduplication is epsilon iota instead of the usual epsilon. See Morphology of Biblical Greek for an explanation. The stem vowel alpha lengthens to eta through oblot, and the beta is aspirated to a phi. It's a second perfect, so the tense formative is alpha and not kappa alpha. So lob becomes alob, becomes alabe, becomes aleph, becomes alepha. Now, I believe that makes sense, but it's too complicated to remember. So here you should simply memorize the perfect active tense form, alepha. The tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section in the back also lists a perfect middle passive tense form, alemi, and comments the same changes present in the perfect active are present here as well. The beta has changed to mu because of the following mu. However, there are no examples of the perfect middle passive tense form in the New Testament. I found one in the LXX, but only one. This perfect middle passive form is also not found in the previous word section on page 233 of Basics of Biblical Greek, 3rd edition. So I would not take the time to learn that form. Continuing on from lambano, we come to pros erchomai, which has a perfect active tense form of pros elelutha. Here you need to remember that erchomai has a perfect active form elelutha, and we've simply added the pros at the front. Elelutha is different enough that you would be best off just memorizing the form. The verb has multiple roots, as you recall, I hope. The perfect tense form comes from the root el-youth, and the form has both reduplicated and then undergone vocalic reduplication, and the epsilon has dropped out. It is a second perfect, so only alpha, not kappa alpha, is the tense formative. So el-youth went to el-youth, went to el-leluth, went to el-lelutha. Now, I believe you can see how that happened after we explained it, but remembering it is too complicated. So you should just memorize the perfect active form elelutha from erchomai. But once you have that taken care of, you do not need to separately memorize pros elelutha because you'll recognize that it comes from pros erchomai. Moving on, sunago has a perfect middle passive form of sunegmai. Know that this perfect middle passive tense form should have a circumflex accent over the eta, not an acute accent over the upsilon. The form sunegmai on page 233 here of Basics of Biblical Greek 3rd edition, that's a typo. It should be sunegmai, not sunagmai, sunegmai. Anyway, you can see that sunago, I gather together invite, is derived from ugo, I lead, with the soon prefix being added. Can you see why ugo from the root ug becomes agmai? All that has happened is that we have vocalic reduplication, modifying the initial alpha to an eta, and then we have the secondary active ending mai added. If you can see why the root ug becomes agmai in the perfect middle passive, there should be no need to memorize the form sunegmai from sunago. For sozo, the root is sod with a delta. The perfect active sesoka has had the delta at the end of the root drop off. I believe that sesoka is quite easily recognizable. Concerning sesos mai, Mounce notes, the delta mu combination forms sigma mu. Sozo occurs in the New Testament once in the indicative, and the sigma is not inserted. So sesostai, Acts 4:9. It occurs twice as a participle with the sigma inserted. Sesos menoi, Ephesians 2:5 and 8. I think that sesosmai is easy enough to identify, so you probably do not need to memorize it. The next section of the previous word section is pattern 3 verbs, liquid stems. You may remember from BBG 20.10, 3rd edition, or 20.7, 4th edition, the definition of liquid verbs. The consonants lambda, mu, nu, and rho are called liquids because the air flows around the tongue, lambda or rho, or the sound goes through the nose, mu or nu, when pronouncing the letter. If the last letter of the verbal root is a liquid, that verb is classified as a liquid verb. Technically, only lambda and rho are liquids. Mu and nu are called nasals. But because liquids and nasals often behave in the same manner, they are usually grouped together under the one heading of liquid. You may recall that we remember the liquid consonants by saying, y'all must now row. The first liquid verb listed in the previous word section is iro, root r. From the root r, the perfect active tense form erica, perfectly normally, through vocalic reduplication and the addition of the perfect tense forms kappa alpha. The perfect middle passive ermai is also regular and should not cause any difficulties. Apostello comes from the root apostel. Why is the perfect active tense form apestalka? Can you figure it out? Pause the video and see if you can explain the form. Did you get it? We learned in 25.8 of the third edition, or 25.10 of fourth edition, that the verbal part of a compound verb is where we will find our reduplication. That is why we do not see any changes at the front of the apa prefix, but we do see this epsilon before the sigma, pestalka. But why do we have epsilon, a vocalic reduplication that looks like an augment, instead of a consonantal reduplication? Well, since the first two letters of the compound verb are sigma tau, a consonant cluster, we have vocalic reduplication rather than consonantal reduplication taking place. If you could follow that explanation, then you can see why we have the perfect active tense form apestalka. If you could not follow it, then you would probably be better off reviewing the chapter and learning the rules better instead of just memorizing the form. This explanation for the perfect active should suffice for the perfect middle passive form apestalmai as well. For agero, we have a perfect middle passive form agegermai. The root undergoes consonantal reduplication and then vocalic reduplication as well. So we have ager to eg er to ageger to agegermai. Since that is unusual, it would be a good idea to simply memorize this perfect middle passive form. Crino comes from the root crin. The nu drops off in kekrika and in kekrimai. I do not think that this makes the forms that hard to identify, but perhaps you should simply memorize them. On meno, we see the form memeneka. We have an eta inserted before the tense formative, but the form still looks quite recognizable, I believe. Let's move on to the final section in the previous word section, pattern for verbs. You learned about this pattern in 20.20 to 20.25 in Basics of Biblical Greek 3rd edition, or 20.17 to 20.22 of the 4th edition of BBG. First, ap erkamai becomes ap elelutha, for the same reason that pros erkamai becomes pros elelutha, as we discussed above. What's going on with balo, root bal with one lambda, that results in the forms bebleka and beblemai? Mounce explains that the same basic change has occurred in both perfect forms. The root of balo is bal. The stem vowel is dropped out through oblot, and the eta has been inserted after the stem. You should probably simply memorize the perfect active and perfect middle passive tense forms of balo. For ginomai, we have the root gen. How do we get the perfect active tense form gegana and the perfect middle passive form gegenemai? In both forms, we have a nice normal consonantal reduplication at the beginning of the word to help us identify these forms as perfect tense. Then for the perfect active gegana, the stem vowel in the root gen shifts from epsilon to omicron due to oblot. So we have gegon and not gegen. Then ginomai is a second perfect. So the tense formative is just alpha, not kappa alpha. As a result, we have the form gegona. Both since ginomai is a very common verb, and because these changes are not ordinary, you would do well to simply memorize the perfect active form gegona. What about the perfect middle passive form gegenemai? It likewise has a tense formative alpha instead of kappa alpha as a second perfect. It also inserts an eta before the personal ending. Those two changes may make it desirable for you to just memorize the form, but it is not as different as gegona is from what we would expect. So if you can recognize the perfect middle passive form just from recalling the root of ginomai, you may not need to specifically memorize the fifth tense form. The next form to know is gnosko, which has a perfect active tense form, agnoka, and a perfect middle passive tense form, agnosmai. Can you explain these perfect forms? From the root gno, the perfect active experiences vocalic reduplication because the root begins with two consonants. We then add the perfect active tense form, kappa alpha, and thus gno becomes agnoka. You should be able to see what is going on here, and remember agnoka simply from the normal application of rules to the root gno. As for agnosmai, we also have vocalic reduplication because of that initial consonantal cluster. Also, a sigma is added before the ending mai. You may not be able to predict that added sigma, but you may still be able to recognize this form without specifically memorizing it. We already discussed erchomai and alelutha a few minutes earlier when we looked at pros-erchomai and pros-alelutha. Heurisco has the perfect active tense form heureka. Can you explain it? The root is heur, and as BBG 25.8 third edition or 25.10 fourth edition explains, it is common for a diphthong not to reduplicate. So we do not get a double epsilon upsilon at the front of the perfect active form. We have an eta added before the tense formative kappa alpha. You may not be able to predict that added eta, but I would not be surprised if you can recognize this form simply from a knowledge of the rules without specifically committing it to memory. The perfect active of Lego is ereka, and its perfect middle passive form is eremai. These forms are very different, and you should simply memorize them, as you should all the tense forms of that very common verb, Lego. But what's going on, in case you want to know? On page 233 of the third edition of Basics of Biblical Greek, Mounce says the perfect tense stem is built from the root er, as is the aorist passive. But the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section says the root from which the perfect comes is actually where, digamma, epsilon rho. Concerning the perfect active, Mounce notes that it receives a syllabic augment and the digamma dropped out. It inserts an eta before the tense formative. So eta plus where plus a plus kappa alpha gives you ereka to ereka. The perfect middle passive follows the same pattern of change as the perfect active. Now, this is all very interesting, but basically what it means is that the changes are complex, and so I say to you that you should simply memorize the tense forms of Lego. Finally, the perfect active tense form of pino is pepoka. From the root pi, we have regular consonantal reduplication, but then the stem vowel yoda has shifted to omega due to oblong. Finally, we have the standard perfect tense form, kappa alpha. This perfect tense form is different enough that you would do well to just memorize it. So that's it for the previous words section in the third edition of Basics of Biblical Greek. There's no equivalent section in the fourth edition, although the fourth edition did have a previous words section in earlier chapters, such as in chapter 24. Because now that you know all 6 verb tense forms, you can simply look at the appendix entitled Tense Forms of Words Occurring 50 Times or More in the New Testament at the back of your Basics of Biblical Greek textbook. We went through the previous words section here, both to reinforce the chapter's material on the perfect tense and to demonstrate the sort of thing that you should be able to do for all 6 tense forms for the verbs in the tense forms of words occurring 50 times or more section. Mounce gives some good advice on what to do with the words in this section in 25.21 of the third edition or 25.17 of the fourth edition. Mounce explains, you now know all the tenses in the indicative. It's important that you spend some quality time going through the chart entitled Tense Forms of Verbs Occurring 50 Times or More in the New Testament in the appendix. What does Mounce mean by spend some quality time going through the chart? He means doing the same sort of thing that we have just been doing in the previous words list. Doing this with the verbs that you know in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more section will reinforce your knowledge of the tense forms and their formation, and will help you to recognize many tense forms in the New Testament with significantly less memorization than would otherwise be required. Mounce says, you know most of the verbs, and you should work through each one, asking yourself, do I see the root in the different tense stems? Do I understand how the tense stems are related to the verbal root and to each other? Do I need to memorize a particular tense form? This is good advice. You should take it and do what we have been doing with the perfect tense forms with all the tense forms for the verbs in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more section. Perhaps you can skip verbs you have not yet learned, but at the least you should do it with all the verbs you have learned up to this point. In the appendix, there is also a summary chart of luo in all the tenses and voices. There are also a series of charts covering the indicative. This would be a good time to review them, making sure you can recognize every form. These charts are on pages 357 to 359 of the third edition of VBG and 432 to 439 of the fourth edition of VBG. You should indeed go through these charts and make sure that you recognize every form. Now, the charts also cover a much rarer class of verbs that you will not meet until chapter 34, whose lexical forms end in mu iota and not omega. This is the athematic conjugation. Ignore these words in the charts until you learn chapter 34. Also, ignore material in the charts that pertains to moods outside of the indicative. You have not yet learned the subjunctive, for example. But you should be able to recognize everything that pertains to the standard or thematic verbs in the indicative mood that we have been learning about in the last number of chapters. We are not going to go through every form in the tense forms of words occurring 50 times or more section in this video. The type of thing you should be able to do has already been illustrated as we've gone through the previous words section. However, let's take a look at the tense forms of words occurring 50 times or more section at the back of your text right now. So it starts on page 370 of the third edition or page 450 of the fourth edition of Basics of Biblical Greek. BBG's third edition has some useful information on pages 370, 371 before getting into the actual forms on page 372. That material is omitted in the fourth edition, but I think it's useful, so we're going to take a look at it now. So here we are on page 370 of the third edition of Basics of Biblical Greek, the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section. Mounce says, the chart on the following pages lists the verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament, including their different basic tense forms that specifically occur in the New Testament. The words are available in spreadsheet format from chapter 16 on the online class at technia.com. Now, the website technia.com is now defunct, but I think you should be able to cut and paste these words into your own spreadsheet if you have Mounce's textbook on Accordance or Logos Bible software quite easily. And I would not be surprised if you can still find a spreadsheet like this online. So let's go on. There are three verb categories. As far as memorization is concerned, there are three different categories of verbs. Note that the suggestions Mounce is about to give for what to memorize and not memorize, those are only suggestions, although they are likely to be helpful ones for many people. So first, we have regular verbs. You should not memorize the tense forms of these verbs. There's no reason to do so. In other words, learn the rules well. Once you know the rules well, memorizing all the forms of these verbs will not be necessary. If you just know the lexical form and the root, you will be able to reproduce the rest of the forms. Now, you do need to be able to reproduce the rest of the forms, as I may ask you to supply all the tense forms of a verb as part of a vocabulary quiz or a test. But more importantly than helping you pass a test, Mounce's point here is not to save you from having any work by just not learning the tense forms, but to save you from unnecessary work by knowing the rules well so you do not need to memorize nearly as many forms. So the point is not that you do not need to know the tense forms of these verbs. You do need to know their tense forms. The point is that you can gain the ability to recognize and reproduce their tense forms by knowing the rules, rather than by rote memory apart from the rules. So next we have verbs that undergo regular changes. As you work through BBG, you saw patterns in the formation of the different tense stems. If you know the rules governing these changes, there is no need to memorize these verbs either. The rules that you need to know are listed below, and the changes are explained in the footnotes to the tense forms. It's not quite as obvious that you do not need to memorize the tense forms when the changes are regular as when the verbs are completely regular, but I agree overall with Mounce's point here. If you know the rules that govern these changes, there should be no need to specifically memorize these forms. Then we come to verbal forms that you need to memorize. Some tense forms are so difficult that it is easiest simply to memorize them. These forms are in blue in the following chart. Resist the temptation to memorize forms that are not highlighted in blue. Learn the rules and memorize as few forms as possible. Here we encounter a difference between the third edition and fourth editions of BBG. The tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more chart in the third edition of Basics of Biblical Greek has some forms in blue, indicating that these forms are especially difficult and should probably just be memorized. The fourth edition has eliminated the forms in blue. I like having the blue forms, as in the third edition. I think it's a useful suggestion to memorize only the blue forms and figure the rest of them out using the rules. However, and perhaps this is why the fourth edition of BBG got rid of the blue forms, the words in blue are only Mounce's suggestion. If you can figure out a blue form using the rules, you do not need to memorize it. If you cannot figure out a form that is not in blue simply by using the rules, you will need to memorize it. So as long as you remember that the forms in blue are only a suggestion, not a hard and fast rule, I believe that having them is useful. But remember that what you really need to do is to go through the entire chart and see for each verb what you need to memorize and what you can figure out simply by using the rules. If a compound verb has a tense form that should be memorized, only the simple form of that verb is highlighted in blue. For example, the aorist passive of ballo, eblathane, is highlighted in blue, but the aorist passive of ekballo, ekblathane, is not highlighted. If you know the first, you should know the second. This is a good point. There's no need to memorize the forms of compound verbs separately from the uncompounded simple form. Rules governing the chart. Do not memorize the entire chart. If you rely on rote memory, then you probably will not be able to continue using Greek throughout your ministry. The warning about not being able to continue to use Greek throughout your ministry may be overly dire, but I think he's right that you would do much better learning the rules than trying to memorize the entire chart. Your goal is indeed to be able to continue to study God's word in Greek the rest of your life, and knowing the rules is much more likely to help you continue to do so than neglecting the rules and just memorizing forms without knowing the rules. The tense stems follow the usual order: present, future active / middle, aorist active / middle, perfect active, perfect middle / passive, aorist / future passive. This may be obvious to most mathetai, but just in case, you obviously need to know what the different tense forms represent. You can't be unaware that the second tense form is the future active and middle, while the fourth is the perfect active, for example. Note that in this section in the back, unlike in the several chapters where vocabulary words are listed when first learned, The imperfect is not listed with the tense stems, since it can simply be derived from the present tense stem. If the verb in simple or compound form does not occur in a specific tense in the Greek Testament, it is not listed. There is a dash in its place. Changes to a compound verb are explained in the listing of the simple verb. For example, eis erchomai is explained under erchomai. If the simple verb is not included in this chart, one of the compound verbs has the explanations, and the other compounds with the simple verb reference that compound. For example, the root bino does not occur. I have described the changes of the root bino under anabino, and katabino refers you to anabino. These 91 verbs are the most important to memorize. The basic rule is that the more a word is used, the more irregular or modified it becomes. Therefore, as you learn verbs that occur less than 50 times, there is an increased chance that they will be fully regular. Note that 91 verbs is not very many. Memorizing a minority of tense forms from 91 verbs and using rules that determine the rest of the tense forms is a goal that's well within reach. You can definitely do this. Regular and irregular are unfortunate choices of terms because Greek verbs are regular. It's just that in some cases, the rules governing the changes are so esoteric that it is simplest to memorize the verbal form and not the rules. So Mounce is really into saying that all Greek verbs are regular, but the rules are sometimes just too complicated. But the point that you can use rules to learn the regular forms and only memorize the irregular ones is certainly well taken, as we have noted before. All explanations of changes assume you know the verbal root or roots of the verb. Roots are listed in the footnote to the present tense stem preceded by an asterisk, e.g., agapa. It also assumes you know the master verb chart. You do need to know the master verb chart. Also, you should be memorizing the verbal root as you learn those vocabulary words. Memorizing one root per verb helps you to have many fewer tense forms to memorize, so it's a good exchange. 8. If something is not explained in the footnotes for a tense, look first to the footnote on the present tense form. If it is not explained there, then one of the basic rules listed below governs the change. As we will see shortly when we take a look at the chart, Mounce gives very helpful explanations for any changes that are out of the ordinary or which are likely to stump a dedicated first-year Greek student. If a tense form does not have any further explanation, it should be because you do not really need such an explanation, but should be able to figure out what is going on through a reasonable application of the rules. What rules? Well, here are some rules that we're going to be looking at here. Rules governing the morphological changes in these stems. If you learn the following rules, the only verb tenses that you need to memorize are those that are highlighted in blue on the following chart. Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? As I said above, resist the temptation and memorize forms that are not so marked. Learn the rules and keep the memory work to a minimum. This will increase the chances that you will use Greek in the years to come. And that's the goal, isn't it? The present tense is by far the most irregular because the verbal root has often undergone some change in the formation of the present tense stem. Single lambda becomes double lambda, as in ball to baolo, and then versus compare that with ebalon, the aorist. Iota is added to the form of the present tense stem. So from the root r, you get ari, and that goes to ire, to ira with the present tense. Compare era when we're outside of the present tense stem. 2. Verbs ending in adzo and idzo have roots ending in a dental. Once you recognize that, the other tense stems are usually regular. So for baptid, the root baptid, you have baptizo in the present tense, and then you have baptizo, ebaptisa, no perfect active, bebaptismai, and ebaptiste. When a verb undergoes oblot, it is seldom necessary to know what stem vowel will be used in a certain tense. It is most important to use this clue to tell you whether a verbal form is in the present or not. If there has been ablaut, then you know it is not in the present tense, and you can find other clues as to its proper parsing. So apostello goes to apestela, and then you have apestalka. And you could see that ablaut taking place outside the present tense. So in other words, note the difference between apostello with that epsilon to apestela, and here you have apestalka. So that's where we've got our ablaut going on. If a verb undergoes ablaut throughout the tenses, it is usually noted in the footnote to the present tense form. 4. It is common for a verb to insert an eta, like in kaleo to ekleithane, or sigma, like in akuo to akusthane, before the tense formative and the aorist passive, and sometimes before the ending in the perfect middle passive. So balo to beblemai, doxazo to dedoxasma. This is especially common in idzo and adzo type verbs, like baptizo to ebaptisthane. In other words, note that the aorist passive ekleithane has an extra eta here that one would not expect from the root. And akuo in the aorist passive has an extra sigma in the form akusthane. The perfect middle passive form beblemai has that extra eta here as well. And the perfect middle passive dedoxasmai has that extra sigma that one would not expect from the root. 5. The consonant before the tense formative in the perfect middle passive and aorist passive is often changed, especially if the stem ends in a stop. So ago to akthane. It is usually not important to be able to predict what the new consonant will be. Just get used to seeing an unusual consonant there and look elsewhere for clues as to the verb's parsing. So in this example, Mounce is explaining why the root of ago, which is ug, you have the root ug, yet we have a he here in echthane. Where'd that he come from? Well, that's what we're answering here. 6. Square of stops plus sigma. So labials, p, beta, and phi plus sigma goes to psi, like blepo, blep plus sigma omega to blepso. The velars, kappa, gamma, chi plus sigma go to xi, like k rug plus so, k ruxo. Dentals, tau, delta, theta plus sigma, baptid plus so, baptiso. So the changes that are typical of the square of stops should be familiar to us by now. It is much easier to memorize the square of stops than it is to memorize hundreds of extra forms. So we are not going to go through all of these 91 verbs right now, as we have already illustrated what you should do with them by going through the previous words section in chapter 25. We're going to look instead just at the first two, and that should suffice to give you the idea of what is going on here. The first verb listed is agapao. You need to memorize the lexical form in the root agapa. Then you should make sure that you can explain why all the forms look the way they do, and that you would be able to reproduce them all from just the lexical form in the root, which you should be able to do since the verb is a regular alpha contract verb. Can you do that? Can you reproduce all these lexical forms from the root? Pause the video and try to do it. Did you succeed in deriving the tense stems from the root? If so, good job. You were doing great. Agathos. If you could not get them all, we're going to go through this together now. And then you have a chance to review the rules on your own after this lecture is over. Why is the future active middle tense form principal part agapeso? You should recognize the sigma as the sign of the future. Why the eta before the sigma? Because the contract vowel lengthens before a tense formative. Alpha and epsilon lengthen to eta, while omicron lengthens to omega, as you learn in Basics of Biblical Greek, 19.15, 3rd edition, 19.17, 4th edition. So you can explain everything in the tense form agapeso and can reproduce it by rules simply from the root agapa. You can recognize the root in this tense stem and see how this tense stem is related to the root. Do you need to memorize this particular tense stem? No, it's regular. Do it all with rules. What about the aorist active middle form agapeso? Since the root agapa begins with a vowel, the augment involves lengthening the vowel. The initial alpha lengthens to eta, as you learn in Basics of Biblical Greek 21.10, third and fourth edition. The sigma alpha is the tense formative of the first aorist. Why is there an eta before the tense formative instead of an alpha? Contract verbs lengthen their contract vowel before the tense formative in the aorist, just like they do in the future, as you learn in 23.10, third and fourth edition. So you can explain everything in the tense form agapesa and can reproduce it by rules simply from the root agapa. You can recognize the root in this tense stem and see how this tense stem is related to the root. Do you need to memorize this particular tense stem? No. Moving on to the perfect active tense form, agapeka, you recognize that since the root agapa begins with a vowel, the tense form has experienced vocalic reduplication, as you learned in BBG 25.8, third edition, 25.10, fourth edition. So we have an initial eta. You recognize the kappa alpha as the tense formative of the perfect active. Why is there an eta before the tense formative? Well, because as you learn in BBG 25.13, third edition, 25.15, fourth edition, contract vowels lengthen their contract vowel in both the perfect active and perfect middle passive. So you can explain everything in the tense form agapeka and can reproduce it by rules simply from the root agapa. You can recognize the root in this tense stem and see how this tense stem is related to the root. Do you need to memorize this particular tense form? No. What about the perfect middle passive, agapemai? Once again, we have vocalic reduplication at the beginning of the word, explaining the initial eta instead of alpha. We have an eta before the secondary ending mai because contract vowels lengthen their contract vowel in both the perfect active and the perfect middle passive. So you can explain everything in the tense form agapemai and can reproduce it by rules simply from the root agapa. You can recognize the root in the tense stem and see how this tense stem is related to the root. Do you need to memorize this particular tense stem? No. What about the aorist passive tense form, from which we also get the future passive, agapethane? The initial alpha of the root has lengthened to eta in the aorist passive stem, a vocalic augment. And just as we saw on page 371 of Basics of Biblical Greek, third edition, number 4, it is common for a verb to insert an eta, like kaleo to ekleithane, or a sigma, akuo to akusthane, before the tense formative in the aorist passive, and sometimes before the ending in the perfect middle passive. So balo to beblemai, doxazo to dedoxasmai. So that's why we have agapethane, why this eta is here. We then have the aorist passive tense form theta eta, followed by the secondary active ending nu. You recall from Basics of Biblical Greek 24.5 and 25.9 in the third and fourth editions that the aorist passive employs the secondary active endings nu, sigma, nothing, men, tes, san, not secondary passive endings. So you can explain everything in the tense form agapethane and can reproduce it by rules simply from the root agapa. You can recognize the root in this tense stem and see how this tense stem is related to the root. Do you need to memorize this particular tense stem? No, unless you think that the supplied eta of agapethane would throw you off. If you think it would, then perhaps you have to memorize the form. But Mounce does not think it necessary. He doesn't have it in blue, and I don't think it's not really necessary either. So reviewing the 6 tense forms, agapao, agapeso, agapesa, agapeka, agapemai, and agapethane, you can see that you can recognize and reproduce all the forms simply from the root agapa. Therefore, memorizing the root and a lexical form will be sufficient. There's no need to memorize all the tense forms. A good grasp of the rules is sufficient. Let's say that when you looked at the tense forms for agapao, everything kind of felt right, but you could not really successfully apply the rules to explain and reproduce the forms. Maybe you could explain, for example, the future active middle form, agapeso, the aorist active middle, and the aorist passive, but you couldn't remember what was happening with the perfect active and the perfect middle passive. Well, that would be a sign that you need to do more review in basics of biblical Greek of the perfect until you get those rules down. What if you could identify everything but not the aorist passive? Well, then you're doing well on all those other tense forms, but you need to review the formation of the aorist passive some more. What is a good way to review? Keep going. Do what we just did with agapao for the other verbs in this tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section. Will doing what we just did with agapao take some time to do with all the other verbs here? Yes, it will take some time, but it is great review of the indicative verb. And as you keep going, explaining every form, you'll be able to identify the forms more and more quickly until by the end, your understanding of the indicative verb system that we've been learning since chapter 15 will have been greatly solidified. Let's do one more line of tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament together before I set you loose with the assignment to do the same thing for the rest of the verbs in this appendix. The next verb after agapao, I love, is ugo, I lead. Its root is ug. Pause the video and see if you can figure out how the different tense forms are derived from the root. Were you able to get them all? Well, that's great. Were you able to get some of them, but not all of them? Well, the ones you could not get are forms that should be memorized. If you got them all except for the one in blue, agagon, that is still very good. So you've memorized the root, ug, and the lexical and present tense form, ugo. How do we go from the root to the future active middle tense form, oxo? The future tense form is sigma, and as you recall from the square of stops, combining the velar gamma plus sigma results in a xi. So the future tense form oxo is actually formed perfectly regularly. You should be able to recognize and reproduce it without memorizing it. What about the aorist active middle tense form, agagon? This form, which is in blue, is one that you would have a hard time predicting. You probably will simply need to memorize it. We do have a footnote in Basics of Biblical Greek explaining what's going on. Mounce said, an unusual second aorist. There actually is a reduplication and an augment. The stem reduplicates, ug to ug, and then the reduplicated vowel lengthens, ug to agagon. So that second aorist form, agagon, is going to be one that you will probably need to memorize. What about the perfect middle passive form, agamai? The root ug experiences vocalic reduplication, giving us the ada in agamai. Then we simply have primary middle passive endings added to the stem. No problem. You probably do not need to memorize this form. Finally, what about the aorist passive form, eichthane? We have a vocalic augment explaining the initial ada. We can see the theta ada of the aorist passive tense formative, followed by the secondary active ending new, since, as you recall, the aorist passive uses secondary active endings. No problem. The only thing that is unusual is that the gamma of the root has changed to chi. Mounce explains, the final gamma of the stem has been changed to a chi because of the theta. Recall Rule 5 on page 371 of the third edition of the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section. The consonant before the tense formative in the perfect middle passive and aorist passive is often changed, especially if the stem ends in a stop, like ago to eichthane. It is usually not important to be able to predict what the new consonant will be. Just get used to seeing an unusual consonant there and look elsewhere for clues as to the verb's parsing. So here Mounce tells you that in the perfect middle passive and the aorist passive, the consonant before the tense formative can change. That is why eichthane is not in blue, unlike agagon. Mounce thinks it is not unusual enough to require memorization. I would say this is a borderline case. It could be helpful for you to simply memorize this tense form, but you may be able to get by without doing it, and since everything else about eichthane is regular. So, we've looked at the first two verbs in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more section. I think you understand now how you should go through the other verbs in this section. I would definitely encourage you to do this. It will both help you with those particular verbs and will be great review of the Greek indicative verb system in general. So at this point, you should be able to recognize all the tense forms for the verbs that you have learned up to this point. You should either recognize the tense forms through knowledge of the appropriate rules, or when the rules are too complicated for a particular form, you should recognize the tense form by memorizing it. You need to know all 6 tense forms when you learn new verbs from now on, and need to know the 6 tense forms for all the verbs you have already learned, either through simply being able to apply the rules, which should work with the large majority of the forms, or through memorization for the especially hard forms. We are now ready for our Chapter 25 summary. It is on page 231 of Basics of Biblical Greek, 3rd edition, or pages 283-284 of Basics of Biblical Greek, 4th edition. In the 3rd edition, we have 2 extra points in the chapter summary that are not in the 4th edition, because the 3rd edition introduces the middle voice in this chapter, while the 4th edition introduces the middle in chapter 18, as we indicated earlier in this lecture. So we have seen, 1, the perfect indicates a completed action whose effects are felt in the speaker's present. The action usually occurred in the past. That is, the idea of the perfect is combinative. It combines a snapshot action that has completed, normally occurred in the past, and results that continue into the present. 2, the perfect active is formed with reduplication, the perfect active tense stem, the tense formative kappa alpha, and primary active personal endings. 3, the perfect middle passive is formed with reduplication, the perfect middle passive tense stem, and primary middle passive personal endings. There is no tense formative or connecting vowel. 4, verbs that begin with a single consonant reduplicate the initial consonant and separate them with an epsilon. If the initial consonant was phi, he, or theta, the reduplicated consonant will be p, kappa, or tau, respectively. Verbs beginning with a consonant cluster or a vowel usually undergo a vocalic reduplication, lengthening. Although this looks like an augment, it is essentially different in function. Initial diphthongs usually do not reduplicate. 6, the perfect active uses kappa alpha for its tense formative and primary active endings. The perfect middle passive has neither tense formative nor connecting vowels. The middle and passive forms are identical. 7, compound verbs reduplicate the verbal part of the word. 8, contract verbs lengthen their contract vowel in both the perfect active and perfect middle passive. A point in the 4th edition of Basics of Biblical Greek's chapter summary. Perfect tense verbs can be translated using have or has and the past participle, or with the present tense as warranted by the context. The translation you choose depends upon whether the snapshot past action or the ongoing results are being emphasized in context. So that is it for the chapter summary in the 4th edition of Basics of Biblical Greek. The 3rd edition adds also numbers 9 and 10. 9, the classical rule of the middle voice is that the subject does the action of the verb in some way that affects itself. Only context and the use of the word elsewhere can determine if this nuance is present in a specific verse. It cannot be automatically assumed. In most cases, a middle has the same meaning as the active. Either the middle is a true middle with an active meaning, or it is a deponent. When parsing middles, 10 here, if you can clearly tell that it is a middle, say so. If it is a middle deponent, say so. If you cannot tell whether a form is middle or passive, assume it is passive. So that is it for our chapter summary. What have we learned in this chapter? We have learned that the perfect tense indicates a completed action with effects or results that are felt in the speaker's present time. In translating a perfect, you can use has or have, an extensive perfect, or if the context supports an emphasis upon the present effects instead of the past snapshot action, you can switch into the present tense, an intensive perfect. We learned that the formation of the perfect involves reduplication in the perfect active and middle passive tense stem. In the active, you have a tense formative kappa alpha. The perfect takes primary personal endings. When discussing basics of Biblical Greek 25.5, the third edition, or 25.7, fourth edition in this lecture, we also learned that we should add to our exception list the third person singular leluke, or leluken with that movable nu, and the third person plural lelukasi, or lelukasin with the movable nu. We learned the rules of reduplication. If a root begins with a single consonant, that consonant is reduplicated and separated by epsilon. If the initial consonant is an aspirated stop, namely phi, he, or theta, then the reduplicated consonant will shift to its related deaspirated or voiceless stop, namely p, kappa, or tau. We also learned about vocalic reduplication. For roots that begin with a vowel, the vowel lengthens. Vocalic reduplication looks just like an augment, but it is not an augment, and we must not call it an augment. If a verb begins with an initial diphthong, then the initial letter of the diphthong lengthens. The second letter, if it, as in Yoda, will subscript. But epsilon upsilon likes to refuse to lengthen and remain as it is, despite having experienced an invisible vocalic reduplication. If a root begins with a double consonant, otherwise known as a consonant cluster, it tends to undergo vocalic reduplication by inserting an epsilon before the double consonant or consonant cluster. We also learned some odds and ends. If a root ends in a stop in the perfect middle passive, that final stop will change. Compound verbs and contract verbs undergo the changes and behave the way that you would expect them to. The second perfect is rare in New Testament Greek, and it is probably easier to simply memorize the forms involved. The tense formative for the second perfect is not kappa alpha, alpha on its own. We saw that the perfect active is the fourth tense stem, and the perfect middle passive the fifth tense stem, for the tense forms are principal parts that appear in a lexicon. We also learned the middle voice. The action of a verb in the middle in some way affects the subject. We can use the phrase self-interest to specify this idea. The idea of self-interest is not the same as the idea of reflexive. In Koine Greek, unlike in classical Greek, if you wish to specify a reflexive idea, you supply a reflexive pronoun the very large majority of the time, as in Romans 6:11's reckon yourselves, rather than utilizing the middle voice verb on its own without a reflexive pronoun, as you would were you writing classical Greek several centuries earlier. Matthew 27:5 is perhaps the clearest of a small number of New Testament instances of a reflexive middle or direct middle, where a reflexive idea appears simply from the presence of the middle verb without a reflexive pronoun. Furthermore, in translation, the majority of middle voice verbs in the New Testament will be rendered as actives, either because they are a deponent, the most common category of the middle in the New Testament, or because the self-interest nuance is slight enough that it does not come across in translation. For the most part, you will need to pay attention to the middle voice of a verb when, in context, translating it as active for deponents or passive for middle passive forms that can be either does not make sense. You will then look in the lexicon and see if the verb carries a special nuance for the middle voice. As for parsing middles, you will know the difference between the middle and the passive through the form of the verb when you are in the future or the aorist tense. However, in the present or the perfect, the forms are identical. You should probably at this point default to an assumption that a verb is passive or deponent and see if that makes sense in your translation. If it does not, then you can consider whether the verb might possess a genuine middle nuance. We've also added 3 lines to the master verb chart. There are 2 more lines that could be added to the master verb chart for the pluperfect, which we will discuss in the advanced information section of this chapter shortly. However, the pluperfect is rare enough that it is not included in the master verb chart on page 354 of the 3rd edition of BBG or page 429 of the 4th edition. So you really have a complete master verb chart right here. It is done. So that is great. Congratulations. Look how much Greek God has enabled you to learn. Are you thankful? So how do you form a first perfect active? Now, of course, we know what redupe means in the og redupe column. So a first perfect active indicative is formed by initial reduplication, the perfect active tense stem, the kappa alpha tense formative, and primary active personal endings, resulting in forms such as leluka. What about a second perfect active indicative? You form a second perfect exactly the same way as you would form a first perfect, except that the tense formative is alpha instead of kappa alpha. That is, you have initial reduplication, the perfect active tense stem, the alpha tense formative, and primary active personal endings, resulting in forms such as gegono. What about a perfect middle passive? You begin with reduplication, followed by the perfect middle passive tense stem, no tense formative, and primary middle passive personal endings, resulting in forms such as leluma. So you are now done with the indicative, a major accomplishment. Agathos. Let's go on to the advanced information section for chapter 25. The advanced information section is also large. We are going to go through it, of course, the same way we have the advanced information sections in the previous chapters of Basics of Biblical Greek. This chapter's information is important to at least be aware of. If, say, you're watching these videos for this class and just been skipping the advanced information discussions, it's probably better for you not to skip this one. We are not going to say much more about the pluperfect, for example, in this entire introductory Greek class, other than what we will discuss shortly in this advanced information section in Basics of Biblical Greek. You don't want to get to second year Greek and not even know that the pluperfect exists, even if you do not remember much about it because it is rare. So for the first thing in the advanced information section, 25.23 of the 3rd edition or 25.19 of the 4th edition, what happens if you have a perfect middle passive tense stem that ends in a stop? Whether one of the labials, p, beta, or phi, or a velar, kappa, gamma, or chi, or a dental, tau, delta, or theta. Let's say the forms listed on the screen together. So for labials, for grapho, for example, we have gegramai, gegropsai, gegroptai, gegrametha, gegrafthe, ac gegramenoi. Say it one more time. Gegramai, gegropsai, gegroptai, gegrametha, gegrafthe, ac gegramenoi. What about a velar, like dioko? We have dediogmai, dedioxai, dedioctai, dediogmetha, dediokthe, ac dediogmenoi. Again, dediogmai, dedioxai, dedioctai, dediogmetha, dediokthe, ac dediogmenoi. What about for a dental? Like patho, we have pepesmai, pepesai, pepestai, pepesmetha, pepesthe, ac pepesmenoi. Again, pepesmai, pepesai, pepestai, pepesmetha, pepeste, ac pepesmenoi. So here we have the forms. You can see the forms here of grapho, I write, root, graph. Dioko, I pursue or persecute, which is not a vocabulary word in basics of biblical Greek. And patho, I persuade, a verb that you will learn in chapter 27 of basics of biblical Greek. I think that you will be able to recognize that these forms are perfect middle passive because of the reduplication at the front of the word and the primary middle passive endings at the end of the words. The rest of these words, the middle portions, are close enough to the root that I think you will be able to recognize them. Thus, please view the rest of this discussion of the perfect middle passive as something that may aid you in recognition and will be interesting to the curious. But I would say, however, that for the definite majority of introductory Greek students, being able to follow the rules that I'm about to get into is too complicated. If you do want to understand what we are about to explain, please stop the video and go back through it a few times if you missed something. So for the majority of introductory Greek students, if you just see the reduplication in the endings and have a square of stops in your head, you should be able to determine what the roots and lexical forms are for the perfect middle passive forms that end in a stop without knowing all the information that we are about to cover. But for those who want to know, what are the rules? What is going on here? Let's take a look at our grapho forms. Mounce refers to section 409 of Herbert Smith's A Greek Grammar for Colleges for more information on what is going on with these perfect middle passive forms. If you look at that section of Smith, as well as the sections of Smith that section 409 refers to, you will discover that in the first person singular, gegrammai, the phi of the root becomes a mu. So you can see that red mu in gegrammai. The same thing happens as well in the first plural, gegrammetha, with that two mu's, see that red mu. And the third plural, gegrammenoi. Again, you've got that red mu. Why? Because of the red at the bottom. Before mu, the labial stops, p, beta, and phi become mu. The palatial stops, kappa, chi, becomes gamma, and gamma before mu remains unchanged. This rule also explains the first person singular, first person plural, and third person plural forms dediogmai, dediogmetha, and dediogmenoi. This rule also explains the first person singular, first person plural, and third person plural forms dediogmai, dediogmetha, and dediogmenoi. The second person singular form, gegropsai, is what one would expect from the square of stops. So phi plus sigma becomes psi. In the third person singular, we have gegroptai with a p instead of a phi, because phi tau becomes p tau due to rules that relate to stops explained by Smith in section 82 of his grammar. Mounce explains in this section, Basics of Biblical Greek 25.23, 3rd edition, 24.19, 4th edition, that the second person plural form, gegraphthe, has had the expected psi becomes a phi. So gegraphthe went to gegrapsthe to gegraphthe, contrary to the normal rules. So that's what's going on with our grapho forms. What about the forms of dioko? We have already commented on the first person singular and plural and third person plural forms. The second person singular form, dedioxai, has had kappa plus sigma become xi in accord with the square of stops. Mounce comments on why we have dediokthe in the second person plural. He says, in the velars, the expected chi has become a chi. Dedioxthe to dedioxthe to dediokthe, contrary to the normal rules. Singular form, dedioktai, is perfectly regular. So that explains all the forms of dioko. What about the forms of patho? The first person singular is pepesmai with a sigma. The first person plural is pepesmetha, also with a sigma. And the third person plural has a sigma and AC pepes menoi because, Smith explains, a dental stop, tau delta or theta before mu often appears to become sigma. Section 86 of his grammar. What about pepe psi? Here the square of stops tells us that a theta before a sigma drops out. So pepe psi is what we would expect. What about the second plural, pepes then? Here again, this square of stops explains the form. Theta before sigma drops out, so that is a form that we would expect. So those are the rules explaining what happens when a perfect middle passive stem ending in a stop interacts with a personal ending. Again, it is very likely more than you need to know. Just recognize the forms from the reduplication and the primary middle passive personal endings. By this point, you should have the square of stops firmly in your mind, and that will also help. You will do fine without remembering all the rules we just went over, explaining why we experienced the minor changes we just discussed. Note that the perfect middle passive third person plural of verbs that end in a stop is formed differently. It uses a form of a me combined with a participle in what is called a periphrastic construction. Basics of Biblical Greek will explain periphrasis in chapter 30, so we will put off further comment at this point. Let's move on to 25.24 of Basics of Biblical Greek 3rd edition, 25.20 of the 4th edition, talking about the pluperfect tense. There are 91 instances of the pluperfect in the Greek New Testament in 86 verses. 82 of these are active, while only 9 are middle passive. Mounce gives slightly different numbers. The figures I have provided are from the preserved word, the Textus Receptus. The pluperfect is quite rare in hoi hebdomekanta, the LXX, as well. There are only 206 examples in 200 verses. So what does the pluperfect mean? The pluperfect tense portrays an action that was completed and whose actions are felt at a time after the completion, but before the time of the speaker. Daniel Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics has a helpful chart, which I've reproduced on the screen here, for the pluperfect. Compare it with the charts from Wallace's grammar that were provided earlier in this lecture on the perfect, aorist, and present. So Wallace explains that the pluperfect combines the aspects of the aorist for the event and the imperfect for the results. The pluperfect describes an action that completed in the past has results that existed in the past as well in relation to the time of speaking. The pluperfect makes no comment about the results existing up to the time of speaking. Such results may exist at the time of speaking, or they may not. The pluperfect contributes nothing either way. Often, however, it can be ascertained from the context whether or not results do indeed exist up to the time of speaking. Let me note as well that many of the pluperfects in the New Testament are the verb oida. 33 of the 91 pluperfects in the New Testament are forms of oida. Do you remember that oida, I know, understand, was introduced by Mounce in chapter 17? He mentioned there in a chapter on the present tense that oida is really a perfect tense verb, but it has a present tense meaning. And he listed all the perfect tense forms of oida. Later, in Basics of Biblical Greek chapter 22, 22.18 3rd edition, 22.20 4th, you learn that the pluperfect forms of oida, listed in 22.18 3rd, 22.20 4th, function as the imperfect and aorist of this verb. So, for oida, the perfect form has a present meaning, and the pluperfect form has an imperfect or aorist meaning. That means that for over 1/3 of the pluperfects in the New Testament, 33 of the 91 examples, the oida forms, no pluperfect aspect exists. So remember, when preaching or teaching God's word, you should not say that a perfect tense of the verb oida portrays a snapshot action with results that continue into the present, and you should not say that a pluperfect tense form of oida portrays a snapshot action in the past with results that continued in the past. So how is the pluperfect formed? The pluperfect is formed from the present tense stem. That is, we have reduplication. Before the reduplication, there may also be an augment. Since this is optional, it is placed in parentheses on this chart. The first pluperfect is formed with a tense formative kappa. The second pluperfect has no tense formative. Following the tense formative are the connecting vowels epsilon iota and the secondary active endings. Note that while the perfect employs primary endings, the pluperfect has secondary endings. What are the pluperfect forms? I'll read them twice without the augment and then twice with the augment. La leucain, la leucase, la leucae, la leucamen, la leucate, la leucason. Again, la leucain, la leucase, la leucae, la leucamen, la leucate, la leucason. Or with the augment, first pluperfect, elle leucain, elle leucase, elle leucae, elle leucamen, elle leucate, elle leucason. Again, elle leucain, elle leucase, elle leucae, elle leucamen, elle leucate, elle leucason. What about the second pluperfect active? Gegraphein, gegraphes, gegraphe, gegraphemen, gegrapheta, gegrapheson. Again, gegraphein, gegraphes, gegraphe, gegraphemen, gegrapheta, gegrapheson. Or with the augment, egegraphein, egegraphes, egegraphe, egegraphemen, egegrapheta, egegrapheson. Again, egegraphein, egegraphes, egegraphe, egegraphemen, egegrapheta, egegrapheson. What about the pluperfect middle passive? The middle passive of the pluperfect follows the same pattern as the active, except that it is formed from the perfect middle passive tense form. Also, the pluperfect middle passive does not use a tense formative or connecting vowel. So you simply have the reduplicated root, possibly with an initial augment, and then the secondary middle passive endings. What are the pluperfect middle passive forms? La lumain, la lusa, la luta, la lumetha, la luste, la lunta. Again, la lumain, la lusa, la luta, la lumetha, la luste, la lunta. Or with the augment, ella lumain, ellelusa, elleluta, ellelumetha, elleluste, ellelunta. Again, ellelumain, ellelusa, elleluta, ellelumetha, elleluste, ellelunta. The pluperfect middle passive is rare. It appears only 9 times in the New Testament. There are 30 pluperfects that are either middle or passive in the LXX. So the final topic in the advanced information is the very rare future perfect, which is discussed in 25.25 of the 3rd edition of Basics of Biblical Greek, or 25.21 of the 4th edition of Basics of Biblical Greek. Hebrews 8:11 may have the only future perfect active. Whether it is a future perfect or simple future is disputed. And Luke 19:40, the only future perfect middle in the New Testament. So Hebrews 8:11 says, "They shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. Hoti pontes e desusin me, or all shall know me." So does Hebrews 8:11 contain a future perfect active? A.T. Robertson's A Grammar of the Greek New Testament in Light of Historical Research, Gerald L. Stevens' New Testament Greek, and other sources affirm that in Hebrews 8:11, a desusin is a future perfect active. However, that it is not necessarily future perfect active is seen from Robertson's grammar itself. For on page 906, Robertson seems to say that it is probably future perfect, while on page 361 he says a desusin is probably future active, not future perfect. Blas and de Brunner's Greek grammar, sections 99 and 101 on pages 50-51, state that a deni is an ionic Hellenistic, that is a non-Attic, an irregular, future active form. Mounce appears to agree with Blas and de Brunner, for in his morphology on page 116, Mounce states that there are no future perfect active forms in the New Testament. On the other hand, Accordance Bible Software tags a desusin in Hebrews 8:11 as the only future perfect in the New Testament. It does not identify Luke 19:40 as containing a future perfect, probably because the Nestle Aland textual variant that's present there. Hopefully that will be corrected in future updates to the Text Receptus module. Now, this is hardly a debate in which introductory Greek students needed to draw definitive conclusions, especially since in Hebrews 8:11 we have a form of oida. So the form does not have that perfect tense sense to it. The idea is simply that of a future tense, shall know. So in any case, we can clearly conclude that the future perfect active is either extremely rare in the New Testament or it is not present at all. The Textus Receptus has one future perfect middle in Luke 19:40 and no future perfect passives. The Nestle Aland Textus Rejectus does not contain the future perfect middle or future perfect passive. Thus, the received text in Luke 19:40 says, "And he answered and said unto them, I tell you that if these should hold their peace, the stones would immediately cry out. Hoi lithoi ke kroxantai, would cry out." The Textus Receptus follows 99.5% of Greek manuscripts here, while the Nestle Aland text contains the future active kroxusin instead, following 0.2% of Greek manuscripts. And looking at Reuben Swanson's New Testament Greek manuscripts on Luke shows that just for Luke 19:39 and 40, as it appears in the Nestle Aland text, just those two verses don't appear to exist in any single known manuscript on the face of the earth. So the idea here in the Textus Receptus reading, the preserved word of God, is perfect action in future time. Were the people praising Christ in the triumphal entry not to be doing so, the stones would have already begun to cry out, Hosanna to the Son of David for themselves, providing that necessary testimony to the Lord Jesus as the Messiah, as he rode into Jerusalem on the very day predicted in Daniel 9:24-27. So future perfect active, middle, and passive forms do exist in the broader Koine Greek, although they are rare in Koine. As we have seen, specifically in the New Testament, the future perfect is extremely rare. Mounce, in his morphology, continues, normally in classical Greek, the future perfect is formed paraphrastically, using the perfect active participle in the future of ami, e.g., gegraphos es amai. The future perfect is almost exclusively limited to the indicative. We will look at paraphrasis in Basics of Biblical Greek, chapter 30, Lord willing. A paraphrastic construction involves the use of ami plus a participle to portray a single idea. So the paraphrastic future perfects in the New Testament appear in Matthew 16:19, Matthew 18:18, Luke 12:52, and Hebrews 2:13. So in Matthew 16:19, you have, "And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And that "shall be bound," estai dedemenon, is a future perfect paraphrastic, as is the estai lelumenon, shall be loosed. In Matthew 18:18, "Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." There we have estai dedemena, shall be bound, and estai lalumena, shall be loosed. In Luke 12:52, we have, "For from henceforth there shall be 5 in one house divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3." And we have esantai dia memerismenoi, shall be divided. And then in Hebrews 2:13, and again I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children which God hath given me. Hebrews 2:13. Kai pollen ego es amai pepoi thos epauto. So that es amai pepoi thos, that's I will put my trust in him. Here in Basics of Biblical Greek, Mounce states that there are only 6 examples of the future perfect periphrastic construction in the New Testament. He's right about that. We have 2 examples in Matthew 16:19, 2 in Matthew 18:18, 1 in Luke 12:52, and 1 in Hebrews 2:13. However, Basics of Biblical Greek incorrectly states that John 20:23 contains the future perfect periphrastic. It does not. And Basics of Biblical Greek does not list Luke 12:52 or Hebrews 2:13. This mistake appears in both the 3rd and 4th editions of Basics of Biblical Greek. In light of how rare the future perfect is in the New Testament, what we have covered here should be plenty for you. We have gone on in an advanced way into the advanced information. However, if you use Daniel Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics to learn Greek syntax, you are not going to get more in the future perfect in that text, again, because of its rarity. So for many students of Greek, our discussion here is as much as they are ever going to look into the subject. I will close our discussion of the future perfect with 2 quotations about the exegetically significant passages Matthew 16:19 and Matthew 18:18 with their future perfect paraphrastics. We discussed these 2 texts in the lecture over chapter 15 of Basics of Biblical Greek. I will simply point out 2 quotes about these future perfect paraphrastics. Julius Manti writes, I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, but whatever you bind, deses and aera subjunctum on earth, shall have been bound, estai dedimenon, in heaven. And whatever you loose, luces, on earth, shall have been bound, estai lalumenon, in heaven. Or in other words, Christ was informing his disciples that he was elevating them to the same rank and privileges that the scribes enjoyed. But at the same time, he warns them not to perpetuate the abuses of the scribes, who taught things contrary to the scriptures. Like scribes, they were to be interpreters of God's will to men. But in this capacity, they are cautioned not to exceed their authority. Man is to ratify and obey God's decrees. This passage does not teach that God concurs with man's conclusions, but rather it teaches that those who live in accordance with Christ's directions will decide to do just what God has already decided should be done. The Latin Vulgate also translates as will have been bound, will have been loosed, exactly corresponding to the Greek. It is the church on earth carrying out heaven's decisions communicated by the Spirit, and not heaven ratifying the church's decisions, as a commentary in Matthew clarifies. While some writers disagree that the future perfect paraphrastics retain their classical emphasis in Matthew 16:19 and 18:18, I believe Christ's use of this rare tense form is deliberate in order to portray a future perfect meaning. So that's it on the future perfect. Let's move on to the exegesis section in Basics of Biblical Greek. So the exegesis section is on page 235 of the 3rd edition of BBG or 287 of the 4th edition. Mounce indicates that sometimes the emphasis of a perfect tense verb is on the fact that an action was completed, while at other times the emphasis is upon the resulting state of the action. Daniel Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics has some helpful charts that can assist you in remembering the concepts here. Recall that the basic force of the perfect combines the idea of a snapshot or summary action, the dot in the pictures, and a resultant state, the line in our picture. Recall that the perfect does not portray the action itself as ongoing, but the results of the action. When the perfect is extensive, the emphasis upon the summary or snapshot past action, while not denying the existence of the continuing results. For example, in 2 Timothy 4:7, the perfect tense verbs agonismai, translated as I have fought, and teteleka, translated as I have finished, emphasize completed action. Paul looks back over his Christian life and can say that by God's grace, he has fought and has finished. Do the results of that fighting and finishing continue? Certainly. And the line part of the perfect tense is still present in both these verbs, but the emphasis is on the dot part. So this is an extensive or consummative perfect. I prefer the term extensive to consummative because extensive and intensive form a nice contrasting pair. How do the extensive perfects of 2 Timothy 4:7 compare with the intensive perfect in Luke 5:20? In Luke 5:20, the perfect tense verb apheontai is translated as are forgiven because the emphasis is upon the continuing results of the completed past action of the man's sins being forgiven. The sins were forgiven in the past at a point in time, and the result is that they continue to be forgiven. For after all, as with all the redeemed, the man is eternally secure. The emphasis upon the continuing results does not eliminate the reality of the snapshot past action. Both are present, but the emphasis is upon the results. In other words, in Luke 5:20, with the intensive perfect apheontai are forgiven, the line is thick and the dot is small. With the extensive perfects agonismai and teteleka in 2 Timothy 4:7, I have fought and I have finished, the dot is large and the line is thick. What about Romans 5:5? Is the emphasis of the perfect tense verb ekekatai, that the love of God has been shed abroad or poured out in our hearts, an extensive perfect? Or that the love of God is shed abroad or is poured out in our hearts, an intensive perfect? The King James Version translates the verb as an intensive perfect, while Mounce believes it is an extensive perfect, and he's confident enough that it is extensive that he makes it one of the examples in Basics of Biblical Greek of the extensive perfect. Whether it is an extensive or intensive perfect, the love of God still began to be shed abroad in us at the moment we were born again, and the results of this shedding abroad continue as the Holy Spirit, like rich streams of living water, confirms to us personally, confirms in our hearts by experience the Father's love for us in Christ. So God's love for us has been richly poured out, and it is now in our hearts. The extensive versus intensive question addresses the question of emphasis, the snapshot past action, or the ongoing results. How can you tell? Contextual features, such as the fact that the phrase following the verb is en tais kardias hemon, not eis tais kardias hemon, should be considered, as well as the broader context. I believe the context clearly supports an intensive perfect emphasis, and thus a translation like is shed abroad, poured out, rather than has been shed abroad or poured out. But you can learn from this example that while many times the emphasis of a particular perfect tense is clear, sometimes it is debatable. Although even in debatable instances, we can still determine the mind of the Spirit through his illuminating work and our diligent study individually and in community in the Lord's church. So understanding the Greek perfect tense is helpful for understanding, preaching, and teaching God's word. English does not have a tense that portrays a snapshot action with continuing results simply through the tense of the verb. Thus, one can have a perfectly accurate translation in a passage of the King James Version, while there is still indubitable value in being aware that the Greek verb that is being translated is a perfect tense verb rather than, say, an aorist or present. Greek aorists and Greek extensive perfects might end up having identical translations into English at various times, while Greek presents and Greek intensive perfects might have the same translation into English on other occasions. The translation could be perfectly accurate, but studying the Greek text still helps us to grasp more clearly and fully the mind of Christ in the scriptures. So that is the exegesis section. If you find that interesting, just wait until you get to study Greek syntax in intermediate and advanced Greek. How spiritually refreshing and strengthening that will be. As we wrap up our discussion of the entire indicative verb system, let's take a look at the back of our textbook and review some of our verb charts. So please go to page 354 of the third edition of Basics of Biblical Greek, or page 429 of the fourth edition to see the master indicative verb chart. At this point, you should already have the entire chart memorized, except for the last few lines about the perfect tense. Those last lines should now be memorized as you complete your grasp of the whole indicative verb system by learning the perfect tense. Remember that Mounce reduces memory work to a minimum, which is very nice. But when he says you need to memorize something, you actually do need to memorize it. You need to actually memorize the master verb chart. We're going to go over the lines now. If you cannot reproduce it perfectly, you want to get to that point where you can do it. Most importantly, for your continued progress in the Greek language, and also because it is something you could expect to see on a test. If you have not memorized this chart and the luo verb paradigm chart we are going to go over following the master indicative verb chart, you could set this video to play this section of the lecture over and over again. Or you could record this position to your phone and listen to these charts over and over again. Or you could put them on flashcards and memorize them. Or you could memorize them in some other way. But whatever way you choose, I strongly encourage you to memorize the master verb chart and the complete indicative verb paradigm of luo. So let's look at our complete master indicative verb chart. The fact that this is a big chart should encourage you. You have learned a lot. Agathos. So for the present active indicative, we take the present tense stem, add the omicron epsilon connecting vowel, and primary active endings, resulting in forms such as luo. So for the present active indicative, we take the present tense stem, add the omicron epsilon connecting vowel, and primary active endings, resulting in forms such as luo. For the present middle passive indicative, we take the present tense stem, add the omicron epsilon connecting vowel, primary middle passive personal endings, and have resultant forms such as luomai. For the present middle passive indicative, we take the present tense stem, add an omicron epsilon connecting vowel, primary middle passive personal endings, and have a resultant form such as luomai. For the imperfect active indicative, we take the augment epsilon, add the present tense stem, a connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, secondary active personal endings, and have resultant forms like eluon. So for the imperfect active indicative, we take an epsilon augment, add the present tense stem, that omicron epsilon connecting vowel, secondary active personal endings, and have resultant forms like eluon. For the imperfect middle passive indicative, we take the epsilon augment, add the present tense stem, omicron epsilon connecting vowel, secondary middle passive personal endings, and we have resultant forms like eluamane. So for the imperfect middle passive indicative, we take the epsilon augment, add the present tense stem, the connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, the secondary middle passive personal endings, and we have resultant forms like eluamane. For the future active indicative, we take the future active tense form, we have a sigma tense formative, add a connecting vowel, the primary active personal endings, and have resultant forms like luso. So for the future active indicative, we take the future active tense form, add the sigma tense formative, we have an omicron epsilon connecting vowel, primary active personal endings, and resultant forms like luso. For a liquid future active, we have the future active tense form, which has an epsilon sigma tense formative, the connecting vowel, primary active personal endings, and resultant forms like meno. For liquid future active, we have the future active tense form, which has an epsilon sigma tense formative. We have the connecting vowel and primary active personal endings with resultant forms like meno. For a future middle, we have the future active tense form, the sigma tense formative, an omicron epsilon connecting vowel, and primary middle passive personal endings with resultant forms like par-eusemai. So for the future middle, we have the future active tense form, we have tense formative sigma, the connecting vowel, and primary middle passive endings, giving us resultant forms like par-eusemai. For a liquid future middle, we have the future active tense form, we have an epsilon sigma tense formative, the connecting vowel, primary middle passive endings, and resultant forms like menumai. So for the liquid future middle, we have the future active tense form, which has an epsilon sigma tense formative, a connecting vowel, primary middle passive personal endings, and resultant forms like menumai. For the first future passive, we have the aorist passive tense stem, the tense formative theta eta sigma, a connecting vowel, primary middle passive endings, and resultant forms like luthesimai. So for the first future passive, we have the aorist passive tense form, which has a theta eta sigma tense formative added to it. We have a connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, primary middle passive personal endings, and resultant forms like luthesimai. For the second future passive, we have the aorist passive tense form. We have tense formative eta sigma, the connecting vowel, primary middle passive personal endings, and resultant forms like apostolesimai. So for the second future passive, we have the aorist passive tense form, eta sigma, the connecting vowel, primary middle passive endings, and resultant forms like apostolesimai. For the first aorist active, we have an epsilon augment, aorist active tense form, the sigma alpha tense formative, secondary active personal endings, and resultant forms like elusa. So for the first aorist active, we have an epsilon augment, an aorist active tense form, a sigma alpha tense formative, secondary active endings, and resultant forms like elusa. Okay. For the liquid aorist active, you take the epsilon augment, the aorist active tense stem, an alpha tense formative, secondary active endings, and you have resultant forms like emena. For the liquid aorist active, we have the epsilon augment, the aorist active tense stem, the aorist tense formative, alpha, the secondary active personal endings, and resultant forms like emena. So for the liquid aorist active, you have an epsilon augment, an aorist active tense stem, the alpha tense formative, secondary active personal endings, and resultant forms like emena. The second aorist active has the epsilon augment, the aorist active tense stem, the connecting vowel, secondary active personal endings, and resultant forms like elabon. The second aorist active has an epsilon augment, an aorist active tense form, a connecting vowel, secondary active personal endings, and resultant forms like elabon. The first aorist middle has an epsilon augment, an aorist active tense form, a sigma alpha tense formative, secondary middle passive personal endings, and resultant forms like elusame. The first aorist middle has an epsilon augment, an aorist active tense stem, a tense formative sigma alpha, secondary middle passive endings, and resultant forms like elusame. The second aorist middle has an epsilon augment, aorist active tense form, a connecting vowel, secondary middle passive personal endings, and resultant forms like egename. The second aorist middle has an epsilon connecting vowel, aorist active tense form, a connecting vowel, secondary middle passive personal endings, and a resultant form such as egename. The first aorist passive has an epsilon connecting vowel, aorist passive tense stem, theta eta tense formative, secondary active personal endings, and resultant forms like eluthane. The first aorist passive has an augment, epsilon, aorist passive tense stem, tense formative, theta eta, secondary active personal endings, and resultant forms like eluthane. The second aorist passive has epsilon connecting vowel, aorist passive tense stem, tense formative eta, secondary active personal endings, and resultant forms like agraphane. The second aorist passive has that epsilon augment, aorist passive tense stem, tense formative eta, secondary active personal endings, and resultant forms like agraphane. The first perfect active has a reduplication, lambda epsilon, if it's a consonantal reduplication. So it has reduplication, the perfect active tense stem, a tense formative kappa alpha, primary active personal endings, and resultant forms like leluca. The first perfect active has reduplication, followed by the perfect active tense stem, the tense formative kappa alpha, primary active personal endings, and resultant forms like leluca. The second perfect active has reduplication, followed by the perfect active tense stem, a tense formative alpha, primary active personal endings, and resultant forms like gegona. The second perfect active has reduplication, followed by the perfect active tense stem, the tense formative alpha, primary active personal endings, and resultant forms like gegona. The perfect middle passive has reduplication, followed by the perfect middle passive tense stem, the primary middle passive personal endings, and resultant forms like lelumai. So the perfect middle passive indicative has reduplication, followed by the perfect middle passive tense stem, the primary middle passive personal endings, and resultant forms like lelumai. So good work mastering the master verb chart. Let's go back now to review our primary and secondary active and middle passive endings on page 352 of BBG 3rd edition or 428 of the 4th edition. Note that you can ignore the alternate ending column. You will learn about the rare me, these alternate endings, in the last chapter of BBG. What are the primary active endings? They are nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, nsi. Nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, nsi. When the omicron or epsilon connecting vowel is added, the resultant forms placed on our paradigmatic verb luo are luo, lues, lue, luomen, luete, luusi. Luo, lues, lue, luomen, luete, luusi. What are the primary middle passive endings? They are my, psi, tai, metha, istha, ntai. My, psi, tai, metha, estha, ntai. After adding the omicron or epsilon connecting vowel, omicron before mu or nu, and epsilon elsewhere, the resultant forms are luamai, lue, luatai, luametha, lueste, luantai. Luamai, lue, luatai, luametha, lueste, luantai. What are the secondary active endings? They are Nu, sigma, nothing. Men, te, nu. Nu, sigma, nothing. Men, te, nu. We have an alternative third-person plural ending son that shows up in the first and second aorist passive indicative and occasionally elsewhere, such as in the aorist active third-person plural of gnosko, egnoson. After adding the augment and the omicron or epsilon connecting vowel, omicron before mu or nu and epsilon elsewhere, the resulting forms are eluon, elus, elue, eluamen, eluete, eluon. Eluon, elus, elue, eluamen, eluete, eluon. What about the secondary middle passive endings? They are main, saw, ta, metha, ista, nta. Main, saw, ta, metha, esta, nta. When an augment is added and the omicron or epsilon connecting vowel, omicron before mu or nu and epsilon elsewhere, the resultant forms are eluamen, eluu, eluata, eluamatha, eluasta, eluanta. Eluamen, eluu, eluata, eluamatha, eluasta, eluanta. So those are all of our primary and secondary endings. Are they familiar to you? Do you have them memorized perfectly? You've learned a lot. Agathos. Let's go to page 357 of Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek 3rd edition, or page 432 of Basics of Biblical Greek 4th edition. Here we have the forms of luo in the indicative for all our major tenses and voices. We also learned the pluperfect in the advanced information section of this chapter, but it is rare enough that it does not appear in the paradigm chart here. So what are the present active indicative forms of luo? They are luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, luusi. Luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, luusi. What about the present middle indicative? The forms are luamai, lue, luatai, luamatha, luasta, luantai. Luamai, lue, luatai, luamatha, luasta, luantai. The present passive indicative forms are identical to the forms of the present middle indicative. What are the imperfect active indicative forms of luo? They are eluon, elus, elue, eluamen, eluete, eluon. Eluon, elus, elue, eluamen, eluete, eluon. Next, the imperfect middle forms are eluamen, eluu, eluata, eluamatha, eluesta, eluanta. Eluamen, eluu, eluata, eluamatha, eluesta, eluanta. The imperfect passive forms are identical to the imperfect middle forms. What about the future active forms of luo? They are luso, luses, luse, lusamen, lusete, lususi. Luso, luses, luse, lusamen, lusete, lususi. The future middle indicative forms are lusamai, luse, lusatai, lusamatha, lusesta, lusantai. Lusamai, luse, lusatai, lusamatha, lusesta, lusantai. The future passive forms in the indicative are luthesamai, luthese, luthesatai, luthesamatha, luthesesta, luthesantai, luthesamai, luthese, luthesatai, luthesamatha, luthesesta, luthesantai. Moving on, the first aorist active indicative forms of luo are elusa, elusas, eluse, elusamen, elusate, elusan. Elusa, elusas, eluse, elusamen, elusate, elusan. The first aorist middle indicative forms are elusamen, eluso, elusata, elusamatha, elusaste, elusanta. Elusamen, eluso, elusata. elusamatha, elusasthe, elusanta. The first aorist passive indicative forms are eluthane, eluthes, eluthe, eluthemen, eluthete, elutheson, eluthane, eluthes, eluthe, eluthemen, eluthete, elutheson. What about the second aorist active indicative? For the second aorist, we are using lambano, aorist tense form elabon, as our paradigmatic form because luo has a first aorist, not a second aorist. So the second aorist active indicative forms of lambano are elabon, elabes, elabe, elabamen, elabete, elabon, elabon, elabes, elabe, elabamen, elabete, elabon. What about the second aorist middle indicative? Here, we are using ginomine, aorist middle tense form egonomane, for our paradigm because, again, luo has a first aorist, not a second aorist. The second aorist middle indicative forms of ginomai are egonomane, egenu, egenita, egonomatha, egenisthe, egenonta, egonomane, egenu, egenita, egonomatha, egenisthe, egenonta. What about the second aorist passive indicative? Again, we cannot use luo, so we use grapho, aorist passive tense form, agraphane, for a paradigm. The second aorist passive indicative forms of grapho are agraphane, agraphes, agraphe, agraphemen, agraphete, agrapheson, agraphane, agraphes, agraphe, agraphemen, agraphyta, agrapheson. Finally, let's look at the perfect tense. What are the perfect active indicative forms of luo? They are laluka, lalukas, laluka, lalukamen, lalukate, lalukasi, laluka, lalukas, laluka, lalukamen, lalukate, lalukasi. What about the perfect middle indicative? The forms are lalamai, lalasai, lalatai, lalamatha, lalastha, lalantai, lalamai, lalasai, lalatai, lalamatha, lalastha, lalantai. The perfect passive forms in the indicative are identical to the perfect middle indicative. Are these forms familiar to you? You have learned a lot. Agathos, agathos, agathos. On page 229 of the third edition of Basics of Biblical Greek, Bill Mounce makes an argument that charismatics would welcome, while those who recognize the biblical fact of the cessation of the sign gifts would question. I mentioned this fact earlier in our study of this chapter. It is now time to take a look at what Mounce teaches. It concerns the middle voice of the verb pauo, I cease, in 1 Corinthians 13:8. Let's take a look at the passage first. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Eon tais, glossais ton anthropon lalo kaiton angelon, agapen demeacho, geganakalkas ekon, e kubbalon alaladzon. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. Kai an echo propheteon, kai edo ta mysteria panta, kai pasantain gnosin, kai an echo pasantain piston, hosta are methistanein, agapein de me echo, uden emi. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Kae an psomiso panta tahu par kantamu, kae an parado taso mamu hina kauthesomai, agapein de me echo, uden ophelumai. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up. He agape, makrathume, Christu etai. he agape u zeloi, he agape u herperiutai, u fusiutai. Doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil. Askemane, u zete tahautes, u paroxunatai, u lagizatai takakan. Rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. U kaire epitai adikia, sub kaire de te aletheia. Beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Panta stege, panta pistue, panta elpidze, panta hupamene. Charity never faileth. Whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. He agape udepata ekpipte, eta de prophetei, katar gethesantai, eta glossai, pausantai, eta gnosis, katar gethesantai. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. Ekmerus gar genoskamen, kai ekmerus prophetuamen. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. Hata de elthe ta teleon, tata ta ekmerus, katar gethesatai. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Hata amen in nepeos, hos nepeos elalun, hos nepeos ephronun, hos nepeos elagizamen, hata de gegane aner, kater geka ta tu nepeu. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. Blepamen gar arti di esopteru en enigmati. Tata de prosopon prosopon. Arti genosko ekmerus. Tata de epignosamai kathos kai epignosthein. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. Noni de mene pistis, elpis, agape. Tatria taota, maidzon de tuton, he agape. With that context, let's consider Mounce's argument. On page 229 of the third edition of Basics of Biblical Greek, William Mounce argues, just because a verb is in the middle does not mean the self-interest nuance is present. It is possible that other verbs will have the self-interest nuance in specific contexts. As always, context must be the ultimate decider. That statement is true enough, but let's see what Mounce proceeds to argue in footnote 17 on that page. A good example of the problems caused by assuming that the classical use of the middle is always present is found in 1 Corinthians 13:8, where Paul says that the gifts of tongues will cease, pausantai. It is argued by some that because pausantai is middle, Paul is saying the gift of tongues will cease in and of itself. Regardless of one's views on the topic of spiritual gifts, I, Mounce, feel this is an incorrect interpretation of the middle. It assumes that the middle here has the classical usage, even though BDAG lists no self-interest meaning for the middle of pao. And when you look at the other 8 occurrences of the verb, it is seen that the verb is a middle deponent and not reflexive. The best example is in Luke 8:24, where Jesus calms the sea. Jesus awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and a calm took place. Ha de diergethes epitimesin to anemo kai to kludoni to hudatos kai epausanta kai agenita galene. The wind and water certainly did not cease in and of themselves. The middle of this verb does not designate self-interest. It is deponent. Now, there are numbers of problems with this argument that William Mounce is making. First, is it true that pao is deponent in the future tense form? BDAG does not say so. Notice we have future active forms, we have future middle forms, and future passive forms, all listed as extant in Koine Greek. That is not what we would expect for the future middle, merely deponent. The verb pow appears in 15 verses in the Greek New Testament. 14 of the 15 are in the middle. I'm not sure why Mounce said there were only 8 other occurrences of the verb, as that is plainly incorrect. But we also have one active voice usage with glossa, tongue no less, in 1 Peter 3:10. So 1 Peter 3:10, for he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, and his lips that they speak no guile. So let him refrain his tongue is pausatao tain glosson. So we can see that pow certainly was not always in the middle, as in the New Testament we have an aorist active imperative in 1 Peter 3:10. And the only other instance in the New Testament outside of 1 Corinthians 13:8 where pow is used in connection with the tongue or tongues. Furthermore, we should consider that with only 15 instances of pow in the New Testament, we could use a larger sample size. The active of pow in 1 Peter 3:10 is referencing the LXX. In Psalm 34 in English, which is Psalm 33 in the LXX, we again have an aorist active imperative in keep thy tongue from evil and thy lips from speaking guile. And pow appears 77 times in 74 verses in the LXX, including the Apocrypha, which is a much larger sample size than the 15 uses in the New Testament. These 77 uses include numbers of future active uses. So in Deuteronomy 32:26, we have pauso, I will cause to cease. In Job 6:26, we have pause, cause to cease. In Isaiah 58:12, we have pauses, thou shalt cause to be in peace. And then we have Ode 2:26, pauso, I will cause to cease again. We have clear future actives of pao in the LXX. We also have a goodly number of future middle uses. So, for example, Exodus 9:29, we have pausantai, shall cease, thundering cease. We have 1 Chronicles 21:22, pausatai, plague shall cease. We have Isaiah 10:25. We have pausatai, shall cease. Isaiah 38:20, pausamai, I will cease. We have numbers of instances here. We also have, by the way, back in that Exodus 9:29, you can also look at verses 33-34 for other uses of the future. So we have more passages in addition to just those ones as well. We have Isaiah 57:10, Jeremiah 28:63, 31:2, 32:37, lots of other texts here where we have future middles of pow. So we have future actives of pow, we have future middles of pow, and so this doesn't look deponent really at all. Now, words do change over time. Is the future active only present in the time when the LXX was translated, but was it gone by the time of the New Testament? Well, no. So the future active of pow appears in Josephus, in Gregory of Nazianzus, and Athanasius, in the Pseudo-Clementine homilies, and in the Pseudepigrapha, and in Epictetus. The future passive appears, it's more rare, but it appears in Justin Martyr, it appears in Athanasius, and there's also quite a few future middles as well. And these are just the sources that I have, extra biblical texts in my Accordance Bible software. So clearly the future active was a live option in Greek, not just when the New Testament was given by inspiration, but also at the same time and in the time afterwards. And so we have the future active, we have the future middle, we have the future passive. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, we should not say that the future middle of pow is simply deponent. The future active was a common and available option, and the future passive, although rarer, was also an option. We see this by simply looking at BDAT, and we can get even stronger confirmation by looking at Koine Greek that is roughly contemporaneous or close to the time of the New Testament. Both pre-New Testament Greek in works such as the LXX and post-New Testament Greek sources validate the continued existence of the future active, middle, and passive of powo. So, powo is not deponent in the future tense form in the Greek of the New Testament era. Notice then the distinction in 1 Corinthians 13:8. He agape udepote ekpipte, eta de prophetiai katarge thesontai, a future passive, eta glossai pausantai, future middle, eta gnosis katarge thesatai, future passive. So charity never failed. Whether there be prophecies, they shall fail or vanish away. Translate either way. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, shall vanish away or fail. So here, where Paul switches from the future passive of katargeo to powo in the future middle, and then back to the future passive of katargeo again, that supports the distinction being present. And of course, we can see that they shall fail and it shall vanish away, translate identical Greek. So one writer commenting on this, though he doesn't recognize that 1 Corinthians 13 is talking about the completed canon of Scripture, although that's the true view, but nevertheless, he gives a good explanation here. Do tongues cease before prophecies and knowledge are rendered inoperative? Several important details imply an affirmative action is to be given to this question. The main ones are these: the change of verbs in verse 8, the change of voice in the verbs of verse 8, and the omission of tongues in verses 9 and 12. The change of verbs in verse 8. It is not without significance that Paul uses katargeo of both prophecies and knowledge when he says prophecies and knowledge will be done away. However, he carefully suggests the verb powo when he speaks of the cessation of tongues. Katargeo means to render inoperative, to supersede. In the active voice, powo means to make to cease. Why this change? The change of verbs cannot be accounted for by saying Paul does this to avoid repetition. That Paul did not fear repetition is seen in the fact that he employs katargeo no less than 4 times in verses 8, 10, and 11. The conclusion seems clear. Tongues are viewed as ceasing before the time when prophecies and knowledge are rendered inoperative. The change of voice in the verbs of verse 8. It is significant that the verb katargeo, which is used of both prophecies and knowledge, is future passive in both of its occurrences in verse 8. On the other hand, powo is future middle. In the active voice, powo means to make to cease, 1 Peter 3:10. If Paul had wanted to say tongues will be made to cease by the coming of the perfect, he most probably would have used the active voice. In the middle voice, the verb simply means to cease. Tongues will in and of themselves cease in the meantime. In 1 Corinthians 13, the change of voice and vocabulary in the verbs of verse 8 and the lack of any reference to tongues in verses 9 and 12 imply the gift of tongues ceases before the rapture of the saints occurs. Tongues were a temporary gift that God used in the early years of the church. They have long since ceased because their purpose was not a permanent one. There is a good case that the Holy Spirit, through Paul, intended to specify in 1 Corinthians 13:8 that tongues ceased even before the time that prophecy and the supernatural gift of knowledge ceased. The middle voice and the immediate context support this conclusion. Let me also point out that it is not simply people who have a superficial or cursory understanding of Greek who argue that the middle voice of powo in 1 Corinthians 13:8 has a reflexive meaning. Note the highlighted section from A.T. Robertson's Word Pictures in the New Testament on 1 Corinthians 13:8. They shall be done away, katarge thesantai, first future passive, katargeo, rare in Old Greek to make idle and operative. All these special spiritual gifts will pass. It is amazing how little of human work lasts. They shall cease, pausantai, future middle indicative of powo, to make cease. They shall make themselves cease, or automatically cease of themselves. Now, Robertson is the author of the massive advanced Greek grammar entitled A Grammar of the Greek New Testament in the Light of Historical Research. He has been called the greatest American New Testament Greek grammarian, and his 1,454-page grammar is the most thorough in the English language. So the idea that tongues would cease of themselves is not just an idea developed in ignorance by someone who did not understand the Greek middle very well. It is the published view of the greatest American Greek grammarian, the Baptist scholar A.T. Robertson. Clearly, we would do well to take this view much more seriously than Bill Mounce's third edition footnote would lead us to expect. What about Mounce's second argument that Powwow is a middle deponent? Recall that Mounce averred the verb is a middle deponent, not reflexive. The best example is in Luke 8:24, where Jesus calmed the sea. Jesus awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and a calm took place. The wind and the water certainly did not cease in and of themselves. The middle of this verb does not designate self-interest. It is deponent, speaking about the kai apausanta, kai agenita galene, so the apausata. Interestingly, Dan Wallace in his Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics effectively demonstrates the problematic nature of Mounce's argument here. Commenting on eta prophetiae katargethesatai, eta glossai pausantai, eta gnosis katargethesatai. If there are prophecies, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease on their own. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. Wallace says, if the voice of the verb here is significant, then Paul is saying either the tongues will cut themselves off, direct middle, or more likely cease of their own accord, i.e. die out, without an intervening agent, indirect middle. It may be significant that with reference to prophecy and knowledge, Paul used a different verb, katargeo, and put it in the passive voice. In verses 9 and 10, the argument continues. For we know in part, and then we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial shall be done away. Katarge thesantai. Here again, Paul uses the same passive verb he had used with prophecy and knowledge, and he speaks to the verbal counterpart to the nominal prophecy and knowledge. Yet he does not speak about tongues being done away when the perfect comes. The implication may be that tongues were to have died out of their own before the perfect comes. The middle voice, then, in this text must be wrestled with if one is to come to any conclusions about when tongues would cease. Many today, however, claim that pausantai is not an indirect middle. The argument is that powwow in the future is deponent, and that the change in verbs is merely stylistic. If so, then this text makes no comment about tongues ceasing on their own, apart from the intervention of the perfect. There are three arguments against the deponent view, however. First, if pausantai is deponent, then the second principal part, future form, should not occur in the active voice in Hellenistic Greek. But it does, and it does so frequently. A search of the Thesaurus Linguae Graeci, TLG database, reveals hundreds of such instances, normally bearing the meaning stop something. Further, the future middle of powwow was consistently used in the same period with the meaning of stop or cease. It is somewhat surprising that the deponent view is so often assumed without a prior investigation into extra New Testament Greek. Since the second principal part occurs in the active voice in Hellenistic Greek, to maintain that pausantai is deponent is to imply that the language of the New Testament is a unique dialect. The very scholars who call it deponent, however, are equally adamant that New Testament Greek was a part of the Hellenistic language. Hence, the verb cannot be considered deponent. Second, sometimes Luke 8:24 is brought into the discussion. Jesus rebuked the wind and sea, and they ceased a pausanta, aorist middle, from their turbulence. Again, the TLG database revealed that the third principal part, like the second principal part, was an active form in Koine Greek. The argument is that inanimate objects cannot cease of their own accord. Therefore, the middle of pauo is equivalent to a passive. But this is a misunderstanding of the literary features of the passage. If the wind and sea cannot cease voluntarily, why does Jesus rebuke them? And why do the disciples speak of the wind and sea as having obeyed Jesus? The elements are personified. If anything, Luke 8:24 supports the indirect middle view. Third, the idea of a deponent verb is that it is middle in form but active in meaning. But pausantai is surrounded by passives in 1 Corinthians 13:8, not actives. The real force of pauo in the middle is intransitive, while in the active it is transitive. In the active, it has the force of stopping some other object. In the middle, it ceases from its own activity. In sum, the deponent view is based on some faulty assumptions as to the labeling of pausantai as deponent, the parallel of Luke 8:24, and even the meaning of deponency. Paul seems to be making a point that is more than stylistic in his shift in verbs. But this is not to say that the middle voice in 1 Corinthians 13:8 proves that tongues already ceased. This verse does not specifically address when tongues would cease, although it is giving a terminus ad quem, when the perfect comes. Wallace effectively demonstrates that the argument from Luke 8:24 that seeks to show that pauo in the middle is deponent comes to nothing. And that is even apart from the important fact that Luke 8:24 does not even have a future tense verb, but an aorist, and deponency is tense form or principal part specific. You can also see this if you look at the examples of pauo in the middle in the New Testament and LXX. Many of them fit well and are at least consistent with a cease of itself or themselves idea. Thus, the indirect middle cease of themselves concept is a live, viable idea for the middle of pauo. When Wallace says that 1 Corinthians 13:8 does not of itself prove when tongues would cease, after making a strong case for a real middle idea existing in the verse, he is correct in the affirmation that it depends upon what the perfect is, when and what it is. If the perfect comes at the second coming of Jesus Christ, then 1 Corinthians 13 is still consistent with cessationism. Tongues cease of themselves at some point before the coming of Christ, which could very well be in the first century in association with the completion of the canon, something clearly taught in Ephesians 2:20 and other texts. Cessationism is not at all refuted by a view that the perfect comes at the second coming of Christ. Let me point out as well that when charismatics claim that their gibberish is speaking a so-called heavenly language that is not known earthly speech, and claim that 1 Corinthians 13:1 supports their practice, it would be very strange for the alleged heavenly language, the language that angels speak, to stop being used when we get to heaven. That would seem like the best place to be using it. However, while cessationism is not refuted by a view that the perfect is the second coming of Christ, I believe there are strong exegetical reasons to view the perfect here as the completed canon of Scripture. R. Bruce Compton in the Detroit Baptist Seminary Journal makes a strong case for the completed canon view of the perfect in 1 Corinthians 13 in his article 1 Corinthians 13, 8-13, and the Cessation of Miraculous Gifts from the Detroit Baptist Seminary Journal, Volume 9, 2004, pages 97 to 144. The face-to-face language of 1 Corinthians 13:12 is simply used for complete or full revelation. It is metaphorical, just like the earlier statement of seeing through a glass or mirror darkly. The strongest apparent argument for 1 Corinthians 13's perfect coming being the second coming of Christ requires taking the face-to-face comment as if it were literal. When contextually, it is clearly simply a statement of full knowledge rather than partial knowledge. So Dr. Compton explains, the analogies of seeing and knowing in 13:12 are generally understood in a similar way. To see in a mirror dimly is a metaphor and refers to seeing or perceiving God's will unclearly because of limited revelation. To see face to face, likewise a metaphor, simply means having the lack of clarity due to limited revelation removed. The full-orbed revelation of God having been given, the church is able to see clearly and distinctly the whole counsel of God intended for this age. The same may be said of the contrast in the last half of the verse between to know in part and to know fully. With the completed New Testament canon, believers are able to know the revealed will of God fully and distinctly. In the majority of cases, the expression face to face is used metaphorically in the Old Testament. The predominant use of the face to face expression in the Old Testament as a metaphor argues in favor of Paul using it in a similar way in 1 Corinthians 13:12. This is especially true when combining Numbers 12:8 with Exodus 33:11 and then comparing these with Paul's analogy. So, since the perfect in 1 Corinthians 13 comes with the completion of God's perfect final revelation in the completed canon of Scripture, tongues would cease at some point even before the completion of the canon with the inspiration of the book of Revelation. That is the teaching of 1 Corinthians 13, 8-13. We should also not be surprised that the gift of prophecy ceased with the completion of the canon, as biblical prophecy, although it can teach us principles about preaching, is not just preaching. It is the giving of infallible revelation. Once we had the complete canon, there was no more infallible prophecy coming. Let me also point out that Mounce taught at Gordon Conwell and Azusa Pacific universities, which are continuationist, pro-charismatic universities. The large majority of modern evangelicalism does not practice ecclesiastical separation over much, if anything, and certainly not over cessationism versus continuationism. So it could well be that Mounce's sympathy for the view of 1 Corinthians 13:8 expressed in the third edition of Basics of Biblical Greek is associated with support for continuationism in Mounce's own belief system, although I have not read a detailed statement by Mounce himself concerning his personal belief on the charismata and whether it aligns with the dominant view in the schools where he taught. However, let me also point out that this footnote, which we quoted from Mounce's third edition, has been dropped from the fourth edition of Basics of Biblical Greek. Perhaps the note on Powell by Wallace in his Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics and other scholarly rebuttals led Mounce to be honest enough as a Christian scholar to drop 1 Corinthians 13:8's Powell as an example of alleged misuse of the Greek middle voice in the fourth edition of his Greek grammar. I commend Mounce for dropping this inaccurate note about 1 Corinthians 13:8 found in the third edition of his grammar from his fourth edition. Mounce did well to drop this argument. So if you believe that tongues ceased even before the completion of the canon, the coming of the perfect, and so utilize 1 Corinthians 13, including the middle voice of Powell in 1 Corinthians 13:8, as one of the numbers of passages that demonstrate the biblical and historical fact that the charismatic gift ceased with the completion of the Bible, you do well. That is the true and good view, even though 1 Corinthians 13 is not essential to the clear biblical case for cessationism. So don't drop it. Let's move on to the vocabulary for chapter 25. Our first vocabulary word is aiteo. I ask, demand. Aiteo. I ask, demand. Its root is aite. It's in perfect tense, atun, and its tense forms or principal parts are the future aiteso, the aorist aitesa, and the perfect aiteka. So aiteo, root aite, imperfect, atun, tense forms, aiteso, aitesa, and aiteka. Aiteo is followed by a double accusative. Both the person asked and the thing asked for are in the accusative. Next, we have maulon, more, rather. Maulon, more, rather. When maulon is used with a is usually translated then, not or. In other words, maulon a would be translated as more than, not more or. Martyreo means I bear witness, testify. Martyreo, I bear witness, testify. Its root is martyre, Its imperfect form is emarturun, and following the lexical form, the other tense forms are martureso, emarturesa, memartureka, memarturemai, emarturethain. So martureo, I bear witness, testify, root marture, imperfect emarturun, other tense forms martureso, emarturesa, memartureka, memarturemai, emarturethain. Mounce helpfully points out that the cognate noun martus means witness. A martyr is one who witnesses to the faith by dying. You should not define martyreo as to die for the Christian faith as a martyr, as it does not mean that, but it means to bear witness, testify. However, connecting the English word martyr to this Greek verb can help you remember it. So that's it for the vocabulary. Only 3 new words to learn. That's easy. You can use the extra time you do not need to spend on learning vocabulary, making sure you understand the tense forms of the verbs you have already learned in the tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament section in the back of Basics of Biblical Greek, and in the 3rd edition, but not 4th edition, the previous word section of chapter 25. We've done a decent amount of talking about time in this chapter. It is therefore appropriate that we notice what the professor in the margin of chapter 25 in Basics of Biblical Greek 3rd edition tells us about how to ask what time it is and how to tell another mathetes the time. Note that the conversational koine for chapter 25 does not follow the st-estin distinction discussed in BBG 8.13, both 3rd and 4th editions, and present in the Textus Receptus, but not in the Nestle Aland. As you recall, movable nu appears when a word ends in a vowel and the following word begins with a vowel. The movable nu does not appear otherwise. This rule is followed in the Textus Receptus, but not in the Nestle Aland, with the 3rd person singular and plural forms of the verb me. Mounce in his conversational koine also neglects the rule, following, unfortunately, as would be expected, the Nestle Aland practice rather than the Textus Receptus practice. In my conversational koine slides, I'm going to follow the movable nu rules and the TR practice rather than the NA practice. So to say, what time is it? You can say, te hora fuge. That would be more literally, what time or hour flees. Mounce indicates that modern Greek asks the time in this way. So how would you answer the question, te hora fuge? You could answer that question by saying, esti deca he hora. It is 10 o'clock. He hora is optional. You could also say simply esti deca. How would you say it is 2 o'clock? You would say esti dua he hora, or simply estin dua. What if you want to include minutes after the hour? Simply add chi in the number. For example, to say it is 5 minutes after 8 or 8:05, say estin octo chi penta. You can also say a certain number of minutes before the hour by using para. So for example, to say it is 8:48, that is 12 minutes from 9 or 12 minutes before 9, you would say esti dodeca para enea he hora. If you want to say it is half past the hour, you add and a half, kai hemisus. So to say that it is 9:30 or 9:30, you would say he hora estin enea kai hemisus. What about to say it is a quarter after the hour? You would use the word for a 4th part or quarter, tetartos. To say it is 9:15 or a quarter after 9, you would say he hora estin enea kai tetartos. So now you know how to tell the time in Greek. If there are a number of people in your church who are taking this class, start to say the time to one another in Greek from this point on instead of in English. If you are the only one, you can still say the time in Greek to others because it is just really something to be able to tell the time in Greek. Just don't leave your unknown tongue without an interpretation. Furthermore, you can still use this information when you are speaking to other people who have taken Greek in the past, or when you are speaking to your fellow mathetai in class. Overall, the more you can stay in the language, the better. So that is it for chapter 25 and the entire indicative verb system. Let's sing a Greek verse song and close. Okay. Houtos estin helphon dihudatas kai haimatos Jesus a Christos ukento hudati mananalento hudati kaito haimati kaita pneuma esti tamarturun hati ta pneuma estin healethea hati tresesin hoi marturuntes ento urano ha pater halagos kai ta hagian pneuma kai hutoi hoi tres henesi how te estin he martyria to theu ha pater halagos kai ta hagian pneuma. Amen. He karos tu kriou Jesu Christu, kai he agape tu theu, kai he koinonia tu hagian pneumatos metaponton humon. Amen.